Okay, got it. So how ideologies of militarism infuse, degrade, and distort our understanding of who we are as individuals who are gendered and racialized, as citizens, and as a country, and especially the direction in which this particular country is headed at the moment. So I found it interesting how the title has changed from Terrible Beauties when I first got the invitation, with its modernist revolutionary associations with militarist violence, war, nationalism, and idealism, to Camouflage, which takes us straight to the heart of the problem. Although it's a word that directs us to the visual strategies of concealment and subterfuge, although in this case, someone just left their shirt on the ground. I think someone picked it up. It provides a perfect metaphor for the problems we're talking about today, the military in our midst, where we see them and where we don't, and how the signs and symbols of military power can be hidden in plain sight. So I want to begin with a statue. Statue of a soldier. Not an old one, not an old monument that commemorates a war hero or celebrates a victory, but a new installation that asks profound questions about the rationale and the aftermath of military aggression. So on May the 1st this year, Michael Rakowitz, actually it's Mark Rakowitz, I think, unveiled a new outdoor artwork in Margate entitled April is the Cruelest Month, and it'll be there till November the 14th. It features the life-size statue of a British soldier in uniform, as you see here, one arm by his side, the other raised, with forefinger pointing into the distance. Rakowitz's sculpture is modelled after Daniel Taylor, who was recruited as a young man, very young man, and served as a young soldier with the Royal Artillery in Basra during the Iraq War in 2003, and whom Rakowitz counts as a friend. But Taylor, who was later diagnosed with PTSD, is now, has been for some time a member of Veterans for Peace UK, a movement that originally began in the United States after the Vietnam War. While not strictly pacifist, the slogan of Veterans for Peace is "War is not the solution to the problems we face in the 21st century." Taylor's figure is cast out of an aggregate the artist has made from concrete, calcite, sand and earth from Basra, with chalk from Margate. And in this mix, he has embedded items that embody trauma. So he's used military medals that people have passed on and other votive offerings that have been personally donated by Taylor himself, residents of Margate, and other members of Veterans for Peace. So you can see them sort of sticking out of his uniform. So the plinth on which Taylor is standing bears a plaque inscribed with a statement by First World War British soldier and poet Siegfried Sassoon, who, like Rakowitz himself, had Iraqi Jewish ancestry, and in fact, who the artist discovered to be a direct ancestor. And the quote on the plinth reads, "I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war in which I entered," and that's a bit, there's a military plane going overhead, I think, so I'm in Devon. Happens from time to time. So the quote reads, "I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, on which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest." The artwork was commissioned by Turner Contemporary as part of the wider Waterfront series of outdoor installations along the southeast coast of England. In an interview with England's Creative Coast, Rakowitz explained, "There are many things that interest and excite me about the prospect of a site-specific work in Margate. The history of poets and rescuers looking out at the sea for inspiration and life has informed my project, as has the fossil-bearing rock of the coast, which reminds me that stone is an archive. But I'm also led by urgency of understanding what it means to be at the edge of a place where hospitality and hostility mix." So unlike the famous statue of the Surfboat Memorial, which is a statue of a man in waterproofs looking out to sea, which is also in Margate, Rakowitz's soldier turns his back on the shore and instead points inland towards London and Westminster, where the decision to go to war with Iraq was made. Its formal inspiration relates to a Basra memorial of 80 larger-than-life bronze statues of Iraqi soldiers who died in the Iran-Iraq war, their fingers pointing accusingly across the Shatt al-Arab towards Iran, where they died. So those sculptures, which were a rare example of artwork from Saddam Hussein's regime to bear individual likenesses, were removed in April 2003 during the British occupation of Basra. They've long held a fascination for Rakovits, who was born in Great Neck, New York in 1973 to parents of Iraqi and European and Iraqi Jewish backgrounds. So he asks, what goes through the minds of soldiers in the moment when they witness the figure of another soldier being removed? Do they see something of themselves in those statues? Are they part of a continuous vector of invaders and liberators turned occupiers that will one day also be removed by local inhabitants? In an interview with Daniel Trilling, Rakovits reveals that he intends his projects to be interventions that encourage what he describes as fearless speaking and fearless listening. So I suggest that's really what we should all be doing at the moment. The Military in Our Midst is actually the title of a study of an army base in Wiltshire, a project which is currently in its finishing stages that examines in detail how life is lived on the ground, the impact of the military presence on the surrounding communities as well as the environment, the line between civilian and military, and the textures of everyday life in this strange semi-rural outpost. So a group of us, Paul Dixon, Antonia Dawes, Mitra Pariyar, and Alice Cree, and myself, asked the question, what are the costs and consequences of housing and training a military organisation on the edge of a provincial English town with its surrounding villages dotted around Salisbury Plain, a stunning yet often windswept and desolate landscape? Although academic research demands a fixed time period and quick results, we're trying to take a longer view, assessing how these lines of inquiry make sense after a prolonged period of deployment in illegal, unpopular and unsuccessful wars, but also attentive to what happens when the work that soldiers do becomes far less visible and much harder to see. So this is a new housing estate in Tidworth in Wiltshire with his newly named street name. And in terms of what we see and what we don't see, work by Declassified, who are investigative journalists who provide the news that the mainstream media don't see fit to print. I've made this map, interactive map of UK military bases overseas in 2020. You can see they're sort of spread around the world. And then they've also listed the different capacities that the UK military are in at the moment. And obviously this is too much to read at the moment, but I do recommend that you look at the Declassified. They don't have their own website. They publish their work on the Daily Maverick, which is a South African platform. But they come out, if you search Declassified UK, you probably know about them anyway, but they're really worth keeping an eye on. So in this research, we've encountered the material effects of camouflage everywhere we look, inside buildings, on vehicles, military clothing, obviously. Sometimes it's extraordinarily jarring or peculiar in a supermarket, for example, you know, when you see a soldier in camouflage uniform carrying a baby, for example. Often it's very rudimentary and you think, who does that fool? Sometimes it's almost childish. At the same time, as many of you will know, the armed forces and their gatekeepers, the Ministry of Defence, ensure that it's a highly secretive institution and it's very, very hard to gain access to as an independent researcher. We were not given formal access because we couldn't promise that our book would not sell thousands of copies and have the effect of encouraging young people to join the armed forces. They were quite open about this fact, but this was the yardstick. So no bestseller, no deal. Can't help you. Some of these questions about the impact of the military boot print will resonate with you all in Portsmouth, I know. So when I was researching military migrants, I came to Marchwood, which I'd never heard of, even though I was sort of grown up in Hampshire. But, you know, there's obviously extensive history all along the south coast of military operations leaving and arriving from the port, ports. So few people outside the area will have realised that the flotilla announcing the new era of global Britain to the world left from Portsmouth on May 22nd this year. HMS Queen Elizabeth, 65,000-ton warship, carried 8 British F-35B fighter jets and 10 US Marine Corps F-35s, as well as 250 US Marines as part of a 1,700 strong crew. So this ship, one of the UK's 2 aircraft carriers and the biggest warship the UK has ever sent to sea, and obviously the subject of a lot of controversy about what it can be used for and which planes the UK actually has at the moment that can use these kind of crafts, led the flotilla, the greatest concentration of marine and air power to be deployed from the UK in a generation, alongside 2 destroyers, 2 frigates, a submarine and 2 support ships, on its journey of 26,000 nautical miles over 28 weeks. The group will sail through the contested South China Sea on its way to the Philippine Sea. The ships will also stop in India and Singapore. At some point, they'll be joined by a US Navy destroyer and a frigate from the Dutch Navy. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said beforehand, "Our carrier strike group will be flying the flag for global Britain, projecting our influence, signalling our power, engaging with our friends and reaffirming our commitment to addressing the security challenges of today and tomorrow." Then he also said, "The UK is not stepping back, but sailing forth to play an active role in shaping the international system of the 21st century." I found on CNN, I mean, this was not widely reported in the British press, that Boris Johnson had said that the deployment would help to project British soft power, such as a belief in democracy and the rule of law. So the British soft power would be projected through the warships and F-35 fighter jets and so on. We can dismiss this as a brash and ignorant comment by a man who's known to lie and dissemble his way through public office. But the term soft power, with all its Cold War connotations, clearly has value today in this new world order. Even though the image of democracy and the rule of law being promoted via warships and fighter jets might jar with our sense of what the term once meant, we should note that the BBC was also on board with this exercise, and journalists from the BBC4 Today programme were broadcasting from the ship before it set sail. But what does it signify beyond a post-Brexit exercise in flag waving, announcing to the world that Britain is back? As I said, there was remarkably little domestic coverage, possibly because this was overshadowed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. Then a statement from Stop the War, which I think had originally planned a counter-demonstration, Chris Nineham said, "Reforging links with former colonial outposts across Asia, aspiring to global military pretensions east of Suez, is a policy based on a Tory post-colonial fantasy. All that sending a flotilla bristling with weapons into the disputed waters of the South China Seas can do is escalate tensions and even risk an accidental confrontation with another nuclear-armed state." And then he added, "Even some of the commentators on the Today programme had to admit that it would be very difficult for Britain to get involved in any serious foreign fighting after the controversial wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." However, the flotilla and its stated mission reflect the spirit and promises of the integrated review published in March this year. Number 10 has described this document as the most comprehensive policy review since the end of the Old War. So this is the review of foreign policy and defence spending that new governments do periodically and sort of reorient the country to new threats, new possibilities, and new sort of new kind of sense of what the UK does in the world. So they're worth paying attention to, or they don't always necessarily mean any great changes in practice. But obviously, post-Brexit, the idea of global Britain is a new sort of marketing tool. Global Britain in the competitive age. What does this mean? Apart from very close links with the United States military. So it says, I'm just going to read a couple of bits from it. The UK is a European country with global interests, as an open economy and a maritime trading nation with a large diaspora. Our future prosperity will be enhanced by deepening our economic connections with dynamic parts of the world, such as the Indo-Pacific, Africa, and the Gulf, as well as trade with Europe. I want to draw your attention to some of the framing concepts, words we'll be hearing a lot more of. The first one is the concept of integration itself. So this is a quote. The logic of integration is a response to the fact that adversaries and competitors are already acting in a more integrated way, fusing military and civilian technology and increasingly blurring the boundaries between war and peace, prosperity and security, trade and development, and domestic and foreign policy. It also recognizes the fact that the distinction between economic and national security is increasingly redundant. And then, as it says on the slide, a more integrated approach supports faster decision-making, more effective policy-making, more coherent implementation by bringing together defense, diplomacy, development, intelligence and security, trade, and aspects of domestic policy in pursuit of cross-government national objectives. So that's integration. The second concept I want to draw to your attention is reflected in the words persistent engagement. So this is another quote. We will create armed forces that are prepared for warfighting and more persistently engaged worldwide through forward deployment, training, capacity building, and education. They will have full spectrum capabilities, embracing the new domains of cyberspace, okay, fine, and space, meaning outer space, and developing high-tech capabilities in other domains, such as future combat air system. Okay, so that's persistent engagement. The third concept is the word capabilities. So this is another quote. To develop more capabilities, people, skills, and equipment that can be used across a range of scenarios, we will improve our ability to test and develop our capabilities through contingency planning and regular exercises, bringing together government, the emergency services, the armed forces, other local responders, and industry. The armed forces will also continue to provide support to emergency responses such as COVID-19 through military aid to the civil authorities, and we plan on making greater use of the military reserves in supporting domestic national security priorities. And then we will also consider how to extend this to a civilian reservist cadre for support in times of crisis. So what kind of response to this document, been out since March, have we seen since then? So Paul Rogers, Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University, a stalwart of the peace movement in this country, one of the founding members of the group Rethinking Security, which has created an alternative paradigm for thinking about the concept of global security. In his book, published in 2017, Irregular War, ISIS and the New Threat from the Margins, he warned that, as you can see here, the future of global security as determined by our leaders depends on an unprecedented investment in military power and with it an integrated culture of militarism, which both conceals and normalizes the commitment to armed violence. In an article in the Current Peace News entitled Making Britain Great Again, he wrote an analysis of an assessment of this integrated review, which is very useful. I recommend having a look at it. He says, the UK's security review was touted as the first wide-ranging analysis of defence challenges facing the country, which, unlike earlier straightforward defence reviews, would bring in many other issues from climate change to pandemics. Well, that's what we want them to do. We want them to join things up. We want them to look at drivers of war and not just places where they can go and fight or have a military presence. It's important in thinking about the concept of security. We think about what it is that makes people feel secure and safe. We look at the problems that are making people feel unsafe. Climate change, pandemics is all part of that. As it turns out, he writes, most of these issues that are supposed to be integrated receive little more than lip service, with the core of the review being focused on a traditional assessment, mainly from a military perspective. So he says the whole review stems from a military emphasis on security. And he writes, we've already seen how military spending will be boosted by £4 billion a year for the next 4 years, in addition to already intended increases, while foreign aid will be cut by a similar amount. Of course, we've already seen that the UK aid cuts of 42% will leave about 70,000 people without health services and 100,000 without water in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee settlement. So Rogers also underlines that Britain's nuclear arsenal will increase, at least on paper, by over 40%. And much more significant, he says, details of the stockpile and its makeup will no longer be released. He points out that the potential first use of nuclear weapons will now extend to other possible threats, including not just chemical and biological weapons, but cyber attacks as well. In the rest of the article, he rips through their claims to have prowess in conflict resolution and to be yet again a force for good in the world. Nowhere is there to be found, he says, any acknowledgement of our role in 4 failed wars so far this century. The circumstances of this report raises questions about the civil-military relationship at the heart of government as well. After the 2019 election, when the review was announced, as I said, this is what new governments do, it was widely known that Dominic Cummings was going to play a leading role. And this was judged as highly inappropriate, that the chief political advisor to the Prime Minister was going to be in charge of influencing defence strategy. And it was particularly worrying that he was allowed to visit 5 different national security sites beforehand. And obviously the MOD and the military chiefs were worried that he was going to come along and cut a lot of their grand projects, because he'd made, one of his things is that he kind of cuts out unnecessary and superfluous spending in these government departments. They were particularly worried about that because of his previous comments about waste, particularly large procurements and the system of revolving doors that operates in the MOD. People leave the army and defence sector and move into senior positions on boards of defence industry. In the same month as the review was published, several months after Cummings had been sacked, the MOD put out their own response called Defence in a Competitive Age, in which they agreed that the notion of war and peace as binary states has given way to a continuum of conflict, requiring us to prepare our forces for more persistent global engagement and constant campaigning, moving seamlessly from operating to warfighting. This is another quote. The armed forces working with the rest of government must think and act differently. They will no longer be held as a force of last resort, as if they ever were, but become more present and active around the world, operating below the threshold of open conflict to uphold our values and secure our interests, partner our friends and enable our allies, whether they are in the Euro-Atlantic, the Indo-Pacific or beyond. And again, quoting from the report, in an era of systemic competition, the distinctions between peace and war, home and away, state and non-state, virtual and real, become increasingly blurred. Long-established techniques of influence and leverage, such as economic coercion, propaganda, intellectual property theft, and espionage, have been supercharged by ubiquitous information and technological transformation, and so on and so forth. So we could spend all day talking about their vocabulary and conceptual framing in these reports, not least their depiction of a new era in which global Britain sets forth to confront a dangerous world that's facing multiple new threats. But rather than taking them at their word too literally, I suggest we have to work harder to develop our own analyses in order to present alternative scenarios and solutions. And this means making our own connections between multiple forms of resistance, as well as between the gross inequalities and injustices that drive violent conflict, for many of which we in this country are historically accountable. It's only relatively recently that we see a concerted attempt to analyse challenge and disrupt understandings of military power and military institutions in academic settings outside traditional disciplines like war studies, IR, and military sociology. So I really do appreciate this invitation from a department that focuses on creative writing and culture, something that was unthinkable in 2008 when I was first starting to think about the army systematically. The writers and philosophers have been reflecting on the time of war for many years, and Marius, you mentioned this in your opening remarks. It's only in this century that we've become familiar with terms like forever wars, endless war, permanent war. But actually, it's worth thinking, how does war affect our sense of time? The phases of war and peace that have characterized the 20th century have left their mark on most of our lifetimes. I mean, I was born in the 1950s, a post-war period of peace, or so I was led to believe. It turned out that the Cold War had already been going on for some time, and meanwhile there were wars of decolonization taking place out of sight. Today, few people talk about the war on terror, even though we live through its after effects embedded in securocratic measures like PREVENT, the hostile environment, and securitized border control, analysed by writers like Nadine El-Anani in her book Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire, or this wonderful book in which she was also a co-author, Empire's Endgame. And I like this particular quote. There's a chapter on militarization in this book, which is co-authored by Gargi Bhattacharya, Adam Elliott Cooper, Sita Balani, Kerem Nishantioglu, Kojo Koram, Dalia Jabril, Nadine El-Anani, and Luke de Nerona. So another important way in which the army is being called in, they write, is through the interpellation of people as surveilled and securitizing subjects, willing to report and always reminded that the threat of terror is everywhere. See it, say it, sorted, which mercifully is a phrase I haven't heard for over a year, I realise, as I read it out. I haven't been to many stations. But all over the world, populations are increasingly becoming inured to the prospect of violent armed conflict as infinite, endless, perpetual, covert, and remote. As Mary Dudjak writes in her book on the history and consequences of permanent war, wartime has become normal time. Wartime has become the only time we have. So I refer you back to the alternative media like Declassified, Byline Times, Middle East Eye, and so on, who do inform us, try to keep us up to date with where our militaries are active, as it becomes harder than ever to express dissent when we don't know where they are, what they're doing, and how it is that we can actually formulate dissenting opinions and actions. So the need for fearless speaking and fearless listening is really something to keep hold of. So now I want to clarify some of our terms, not least is the word militarization. So Cynthia Enloe, who many of you know, her work on militarization, her feminist approach to the study of the military as an institution and its impact on civil society, not just in the context of the US where she's based, but she's someone who really thinks as an internationalist, intellectual and activist. Her approach has transformed understanding for a generation. And I think this is what has really inspired the formation of critical military studies, which is a sort of cross-disciplinary conversations among people from different parts of the world on militarism and militarization. Not just within the Anglophone world, but in many other countries amongst activists and scholars. So in terms of militarization, I've heard her speak on this several times. She's a wonderful speaker. I did hear her say once that basically, if you are convinced that the world is a dangerous place and getting more dangerous, you are well on the way to the road to being militarized. Her work has consistently explored the ways in which the excesses of military culture and influence have shaped civil society, with a particular emphasis on the impact of militarism on gender relations, both during and immediately after war, and women's experiences inside or adjacent to military institutions. She's repeatedly defined and explained how militarism, a belief that national and global problems can be solved by the use of military power and armed violence, can so easily become entrenched as common sense, concealing alternative strategies to deal with conflict. For her, militarization is a process, one that relies on the pervasive acceptance of distinctly militaristic core beliefs. And she's made a list of 7 of them. And to quickly sketch them out, they'll be familiar to you. That armed force is the ultimate resolver of tensions, that human nature is prone to conflict, that having enemies is a natural condition, that hierarchical relations produce effective action, that a state without a military is naive, scarcely modern, and barely legitimate. Some of you may remember the headlines in The Sun when Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party. Corbyn's potty plan to ban the army. You might remember that. Be like Costa Rica or Iceland. 5, that in times of crisis, those who are feminine need armed protection, and that in times of crisis, any man who refuses to engage in armed violent action is jeopardizing his own status as a manly man. So then I found a few years ago another really useful article called Power, Place and Militarism, that of course was helpful in thinking about our other project, by geographers Rochelle Bernazzoli and Colin Flint, and they added a few more, that soldiers possess certain values and qualities that are desirable in civil society, that military superiority is a source of national pride, that those who do not support the military actions are unpatriotic, that those who do not support military actions are anti-soldier, that for a state to engage in armed conflict is to serve the will of a divine being. Now, these are all pre-Trump, during the War on Terror. These are during the Cold War. These are, pretty standard definitions of core militaristic beliefs. So I think we need to think about updating them. I mean, Bernazzoli and Flint say that these 12 central ideas constituting the ideology of militarism are driven deep into the soil of society through a multi-tracked process referred to militarization. In other words, militarization is a process of preparing, reshaping, and reorienting society in order to wage wars. Well, we are being prepared and reoriented in order to not wage wars, but to be supportive of something called persistent engagement. The idea of war and peace, we are told, the line between war and peace has been eroded. It's now meaningless. So I would say, if we're going to add more to this list, we should start by saying that it involves the belief that armed conflict is no longer going to be sporadic in the sense of war followed by peace, but it will be ongoing and indefinite. We might add another one, that the range of threats facing the world today can be characterized as a continuum of conflict, in which the boundaries between military and civil power become anachronistic. In other words, a belief that military expertise is required in areas such as trade and development, education, domestic and foreign policy, and other spheres of national and regional governance, such as border control, policing, and the criminal justice system. And our third core belief we might need to use to update this list, which is going to grow ever longer, as you can see, is the common sense idea. And that's common sense is one of the things that runs through these the items on this list. The common sense idea that investment in defense industries is intrinsic to economic prosperity, bringing jobs to marginalized communities and benefiting parallel non-military industries that are able to apply similar technological benefit from technological innovations, industries such as agriculture, medicine, and domestic security, for example. Another one might be that you agree that universities are responsible for policing the immigration status of their visiting lecturers, their fixed term and contract and permanent staff, as well as identifying and reporting individuals thought to have extremist views. We could come up with many more, I'm sure, not least under these new conditions of global pandemic, and the identification of China as a greater military and economic threat to the liberal democracies of what we used to call the West. So now I want to return to the question of the military in our midst and the theme of camouflage, which we're thinking about today, where we see them and where we don't. And I suggest that paying attention to the politics of military work, how soldiers are recruited, how they're represented in media and popular culture. I see there's a presentation about our girl later on today. How they represent themselves through advertising, social media, etc. That paying attention to the politics of military work brings into relief how attitudes, beliefs, social practices change in relation to what it is that soldiers are thought to do for a job and what it is the military is actually for. It's easy to forget that for a young generation of activists, the images of soldiers dying in armed conflict that dominated the years from 2006 to 2014 have largely been replaced by displays of soldiers building emergency hospitals and helpfully herding people into testing and vaccination centres. So how in our educational work against militarism and the state's constant preparation for war, do we hold military organisations to account, particularly if we're not allowed to engage with them in conversation and investigate them as in any other public institution without promising a bestseller? How do we monitor their attempts to normalise military work as a profession like any other? And how are we to challenge that deep-seated idea, so fundamental to nationalism, that military service confers the ultimate seal of citizenship, the right to belong in this country? So here in the last part of my talk, I want to say something about the concept of militarised multiculture, a phenomenon that's helped to reposition the armed forces as a modern, inclusive institution within civil society within the past couple of decades. Now, I'll briefly outline what I think militarised multiculture is, something I discovered during the research and writing of military migrants. So the British Army accepted relatively late and rather reluctantly that cultural diversity might have value as an institutional tool. The tortuous process of reform entailed in reaching this conclusion was to some extent mandated by law, particularly after the Macpherson Report of 1999, which established the urgency of addressing institutional racism within the public sector as a whole. But actually, at that time in 1999, the MOD was about to be sued by an organisation then called the Commission for Racial Equality for breaching aspects of racial equality legislation that existed in the 90s before the Macpherson Report came out. After the Macpherson Report, there was a number of different laws that were passed regarding different forms of equality and diversity in public institutions, and the Army, as a public institution, were obliged to comply with these laws. For example, allowing people who are homosexual to be openly working, and particularly around race and gender as well, gender equality. So a number of different laws. But in scarcely more than a decade then, they reached a position where they could justifiably claim to be a multicultural employer with a workforce, certainly in the Army rather than the other two services, that approximately reflected the level of Black, Asian and minority ethnic population in the UK. So this was achieved, as I said, partly as a result of the imposition of equality and diversity legislation and the threat of legal action in cases of discrimination, bullying and other forms of harassment. But the strategy that proved most effective in raising the number of minority recruits was not suddenly making the institution more attractive to UK nationals who were of minority ethnic origin, but to temporarily waive the residency requirement for Commonwealth citizens who historically had been entitled to join the armed forces. But there was a 5-year residency requirement which could be sort of lifted and reimposed. In addition to the formal recognition of the need to diversify the workforce in terms of colour, ethnicity, gender, sexuality and faith, the institution also discovered, albeit intermittently, that there were advantages in showing a more acceptable face to the public. So in short, the visible embrace of diversity was integral to the process of modernization, as a result of which the armed forces could assert themselves as a dynamic and modern employer equipped to meet the challenges of the 21st century, despite public reservations about the wars that they were engaged in. However, it soon became evident that having an adequate number of minorities inside the army was deemed sufficient. There were significant problems relating to the employment of migrants in the army, in particular, in which the organization was not equipped to deal with, not to mention the increasingly hostile environment, which, for example, affected the rights of families to reside in the UK with their soldier spouse, and the question of the right to remain after service. Procedures to deal with racist and sexist bullying were left to chance, as the constant rotation of senior staff meant that people's priorities moved on. So at the time I was doing my research on military migrants, there was a concerted effort to try and sort out the question of complaints, for example, where people could report complaints of racism, of any kind of harassment or bullying, in fact. And these measures cost money because they were to do with call centres and a raft of institutional people to deal with these complaints, and they were subsequently minimised. So by December 2019, the Service Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces, Nicola Williams, warned that incidents of racism are occurring with increasing and depressing frequency in her annual report, which highlighted the finding that the service complaints system was not efficient, effective, or fair. 3 months earlier, in September 2019, The Guardian actually used the Freedom of Information Act to ascertain how many investigations by the military police have been conducted in the 3 services since 2015. 22, including 8 in 2018 and 1 in 2019, were launched by the Royal Military Police. 9 took place outside the UK. The Royal Air Force have launched 9 investigations since 2015, and the Royal Navy Police carried out 4. And that was partly concerned with people who are on the far right who've been identified in the armed forces amongst the soldiers and sailors and Air Force people. In July 2019, a report commissioned by the Ministry of Defence to look into inappropriate behaviour in the armed forces was published. Air Chief Marshal Wigston led the review and made 36 recommendations on how to investigate and deal with inappropriate behaviour within the armed services. In the Telegraph, this was reported as middle-aged white chiefs, problem as armed forces battle culture of bullying and sexism, report warns. What's interesting about the cover of this report is it's all freely downloadable. There are no middle-aged white men in this picture. It's not clear who's behaving inappropriately. But maybe they're all reporting it. It's really not clear. It's a very odd picture, I would have thought. Anyway, so that my point is really that there was an increasing concern about the levels of racism for members of the armed forces, for personnel, minority personnel in the armed forces, levels of racism and harassment, which have constantly dogged this kind of workplace, hierarchical workplace. The concern was kind of leaking to the outside, and that reviews were having to be done, and they were seen to be putting their house in order. In other words, their institution was in trouble again because of the extent of these problems inside the workforce. So there was this attempt to review and to recommend procedures to deal with these issues. So these inquiries, with their very serious findings, which are obviously off-putting to potential recruits, and more worrying for many of us watching this, an environment in which the members of the far right can recruit, help to explain what happened next. So on June the 6th, 2020, as the Black Lives Matter protests erupted around the world, the new race champion of the armed forces, Lieutenant General Tyrone Urch, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, commander of the Home Command, wrote to all the commanders to emphasize how important it was, in the light of the anger spilling out on the streets of London, to treat people equally and with respect and dignity, while accepting that the army, which they claim, is a representation of society in the UK, was not immune to racism. He emphasised how angry and frustrated he got when he saw the army values that are vital to building trust between our soldiers, our families and communities trampled on. So this is their Twitter account, and this is the letter published in full, which you can read for yourself. And you can see he tweeted it with the Black Lives Matter hashtag, at Black Lives Matter, and also at an account called Army BAME Chair, and also Army BAME. So that tells you an awful lot about how they're signaling to the world how seriously they are taking racism. And also we learned from this letter, the Army has now an unacceptable behaviour branch. And there's also something called Army Diversity Allies, which was also set up in 2019, which, quote, gives a voice at the highest levels to the underrepresented minorities and encourages our people to understand their lived experiences. And the General ended his letter by saying that he personally is determined that we will push back against racism, hatred, and division. So far, so congruous with the response of many hierarchical institutions, including universities, last summer. And in fact, at my own workplace, at the start of the pandemic, at the start of lockdown in March 2020, the Vice Chancellor styled himself Gold Command. And I noticed that the deans were silver, and I was told that there was even a Platinum Command higher up. Anyway, I want to draw your attention to the BAME Army Twitter account, which operates with full consent and encouragement from the chain of command. This is new. I have in the past written about the Armed Forces Muslim Association and the work that that does. But this BAME Army Twitter is new. And as I said, it's a strategic move by an organization, an employer desperate to appear fully signed up to a movement against racism, led largely by young Black people, a demographic that they need to attract in terms of recruitment and in terms of image as a public institution. And it's interesting, if you think about the sort of so-called culture wars, they appear to be on the opposing side of the government, not only because they persist in using the term BAME, but also because, for example, this was retweeted when the National Trust report came out about the connections with many of their properties with the slave trade. This was thought to be a sort of heinous attack on British history. The network chair themselves retweeted approvingly this report. This is from Black History Month last year. This is very typical. I mean, you can go through, there are lots of interesting examples of members of a workforce that are finally allowed and actually encouraged to present themselves as working in an organization that's completely comfortable with diversity on many scales. And this is another example of something that they retweeted. So once again, I suggest that the term militarized multiculture might itself be understood as a form of camouflage, allowing the army to present itself as a modern, dynamic, positively anti-racist employer in a world in which military methods and ways of solving problems are entirely compatible with the liberal values of equality and diversity, not to mention democracy itself. Obviously, there's much more to say about that, but I'm just introducing you to the idea as something which has been renewed most recently as a response to the reviews drawing attention to the problems inside the army in terms of racism and recruitment of the far right. So in a world in which clear markers between the time of war and the time of peace have indeed been eroded, it's more important than ever that we understand the dangers when society comes to rely on the military to solve urgent problems that are fundamentally about politics. There's another document that you can, this was tweeted. The statue of Daniel Taylor inspires us to follow his example in fearless speaking and fearless listening. Daniel Taylor, that's him himself in his Veterans for Peace sweatshirt with a wreath of white poppies. And he's given interviews. You can find him on YouTube talking about how he felt about this statue and how moving it was when he had to, this is actually, the cast was made from 3D printing and he had to dress up in his uniform, and how the peace he felt when he finally took off his uniform, which he hadn't worn for many years. It's very moving to read. So as this former soldier who's renounced his professional military training in pursuit of peace activism points accusingly towards the seat of power in Westminster, he stands as a reminder that art still has the power to dismantle, or at least trouble, the foundations of militarism on which this country is built. And I leave you with a quote from Toni Morrison, which I just found, which I felt said much more eloquently some of the things that I've been trying to say today. So thank you all very much. It's really very, very strange not to see anyone's face. But thank you very much, those of you who are listening.
Okay, we'll make a start. So first of all, I'm very pleased to be chairing the first panel for this morning, militarizing the public domain. In a moment, I'll introduce the three speakers, three very, very interesting, intriguing sounding papers we have. Just a couple of things before we get started. So I believe we're aiming for around 15 minutes per paper. So what I'll do for the speakers, so as not to interrupt you, what I can do is just drop a 2-minute warning in the chat as you're approaching 15 minutes. As with the last talk, we'll keep questions till the end of the panel, and again you can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand or however you prefer to do that. So the first paper up this morning is from Paul Flenley. It's called The Militarization of Russian Public Discourse Since the Cold War. Dr. Paul Flenley is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Portsmouth. His main research interests are in the areas of Russian foreign policy, particularly Russia-EU relations, Russian nationalism and national identity, the Russian Revolution and early development of the Soviet state. Paul has published a range of articles and book chapters on Russian labor history, Russia in the West, the Russian media, Russia and NATO. His most recent publications have centered on Russia-EU relations and the EU, Russia and cooperation in the Black Sea area. So on that note, Paul, if you're ready, I'll pass over to yourself.
Can you see my screen, Holly?
Yes, I can. Okay,
great. Thanks very much. Okay, 15 minutes. Right. Thanks very much for that introduction. I'll do a sort of whistle-stop tour. As you've gathered, my main area is both history and also international relations, Russian-Western relations. So I'm coming at this issue from that perspective. But I thank Tom for the invite to think about this issue of militarization as in the context of Russia. And I suppose what I'm going to argue very quickly is looking at militarization from the Russian perspective. It seems to me a very different relation between the military sector and the civilian sector when you're looking at things from the Russian perspective. Although it was interesting when listening to Vron's lecture, there were some similarities there as well, certainly in terms of mobilizing a population to prepare for war. So when we're looking at Russia, I'm not. Hopefully, that you don't think I'm doing a sort of Putin type of propaganda exercise, but I'm looking at the way things look from Moscow. So bear with me. It's not a critique of Putin. It's looking at the Russian perspective and trying to understand how intertwined militarization is with the civilian sector and the Russian state and society. From the Kremlin's point of view, you have to look at the world, and Putin talks constantly and especially at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, the world is about insecurity, instability. In 2007, Putin said, no one is safe. And Putin and the Russian military elite, the political elite, see a world of international turbulence and especially a rejection of what were the basic assumptions as they saw it of the post-1945 architectures. They see it, particularly a United States, creating chaos in the world order and not really obeying some of the principles of international law. So we can expect anything from their point of view. They also see increasing violent conflicts and internal stabilities in states, and with the withdrawal of the United States from the ABM Treaty, a new arms race. And worse than that for Russia, if you look at a map of Russia, Russia is surrounded by instability. In all areas, Russia has this sense of instability in all areas. In Eastern Europe, down there in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and Russia has to intervene in order to proactively defend its interests. I don't think there are many states in which their existence, they're surrounded by threats in all areas across this vast border. And some of those threats are direct threats. And this is looking at it, irrespective of what NATO might say itself. From Russia's perspective, of the West, particularly NATO, is a threat because it's operating out of area, going beyond its original assumption of the post-Cold War period. It's intervening in Kosovo, it's intervening in Libya. More than that, NATO and the European Union is enlarging to the borders of Russia, including former Soviet states like the Baltic states, but also promising the possibility of membership for Ukraine, Georgia, right on the borders of Russia. And this is something which alienates Russian public opinion across the board. It's not just a nationalist perspective. People like Gorbachev, liberals see this as a threat. For them, obviously, the Ukraine crisis was deliberately started by the West. The promotion of revolution, promotion of color revolutions in former Soviet states is seen by Moscow as part of a grand strategy that the West doesn't need to invade these countries. It simply removes destabilizes the regime and installs regimes which are friendly to the West and displaces Russian clients. And that's partly why Russia is there in Syria to stop this happening again with the Arab revolutions. And it's not just about the West, which is a threat. Out there on the eastern borders of Russia, you have China worryingly as a competitor. What are China's designs on Central Asia? So there's a whole stretch of threats across Russia's borders. What also Russia fears, Putin and the current elite fear, is a kind of Euromaidan revolution, a color revolution within Russia itself, instigated and encouraged by the West. The military doctrine talks of the threat of domestic destabilization of the political and social situation. And this isn't just to do with the existing people in power feeling that they're going to lose power. It's deep in the Russian psyche, going back to the 17th century. This concept of the time of trouble. The West particularly is out there to undermine, destroy the Russian state. And once the Russian state is destroyed, as it was in the 17th century, as it was in 1917, as it was in the 1990s, what you have is chaos. You have a loss of security, and you have even the dismemberment of Russia itself. So maintaining a strong state and resisting regime change or state collapse is an important aspect of Russian concept of threat. Added to that is the terrorist threat coming from, as we saw, the 1990s, the Chechen wars, but also the threat of Islamic fundamentalist groups entering Russia itself from ISIS or from Syria and in through Central Asia. So, and there have been, as you know, terrorist incidents in Russia itself. And that means, unlike, say, the UK or the US, the relationship between the military and society is very different, it seems to me. For Russia, conflict has an immediate consequence. failure to deal with the threats for Russia can have direct consequences for the population. It can lead to the overthrow or the destabilization of the state. It can lead to the dismemberment of Russia itself. It can undermine the viability of the economy, access to trade, ports. And as we know, it can have an existential consequence. The lives of citizens, not just through terrorism, but as we've known through Russian history, through mass consequences. So Russia has, the war and conflict for Russia is far more immediate than, say, for the UK or the United States, I would argue. And that means that concept of perpetual threat means the Russian state, whatever it is, whether it's a Tsarist state, a Soviet state, or now a contemporary Putin state, has to be ready to meet the threat. The concept of readiness is an important feature of Russian history. So militarization of the state is there. It's at the core of the state. So some historians would suggest that the Tsarist state was essentially a service state. Social classes there to serve the needs of the Tsarist state, and particularly its military needs. Arakshia, the advisor to Nicholas I, talked about setting up military colonies to facilitate mobilization of the population to meet threats. The Soviet state, as you know, whatever the ideals of democracy, had to very quickly shift to a kind of war communism and a militarized form of socialism in order to defend itself against the external threats. Trotsky, that great Democrat, even talked about the militarization of labor as a way of reviving the economy. And similarly, contemporarily, under Putin, you've seen this direct relationship between threat, terrorism, and the concentration of power, the need for the center to control what's happening in the regions. After the terrorist threats from Chechnya, you saw the appointment of regional governors. You've seen the increasing power of the Security Council. You see a meeting here whereby there's a need to coordinate directly the civilian sector and the military sector to meet threats. Recently, the Ministry of Internal Affairs has talked about the need to counter internal threats of extremism. So threats come from outside and within. And this facilitates, obviously, what we in the West see as the clampdown on democracy and opposition and alternatives. 2012, you saw the Foreign Agents Law, whereby any NGOs operating within Russia had to register as foreign agents. And that concept of foreign agents has all kinds of associations of enemies of the state, people associating on behalf of foreign powers. More recently, Putin has set up what was called a National Guard, directly responsible to the president to deal with internal threats. Some politicians also, scientists have talked about Russia now being ruled by a militocracy. They see the rise to power of what are called the Siloviki, people with a security background. Putin himself has a security background in the KGB and then FSB, but around him brought to power a whole range of individuals also with a security and military background. Some analysts have suggested what you're seeing is the securitization of the Russian state. There is a big debate about that, but I won't have time to go into it, unfortunately. We'll see, not only do you see this kind of promotion of people with a security background, you see them coming to power with a particular mentality. Analysts talk about the Siloviki ideology, and their view is of the need to build a powerful state to promote a great power, Russia, Державники, as it were. That is their ideology. And it's a form also, it extends to the idea of Russian nationalism. It's about nationalism, but also a conservative nationalism, especially more recently, 2012. You've seen this promotion of the image of Russia as a defender of conservative values against a decadent West. And part of that is obviously the military. Being conservative about traditional values is promoting traditional masculinity. and Putin is the example of the kind of archetypal masculine hero who embodies the new ideology and the Russian state. And it's about ultimately military strength as well. And Putin himself was created, came from nowhere, no one heard of him, but he was created as a result of his capacity to deal with issues without question, clamp down on Chechen terrorists, clamp down on mafia, local crime, using whatever methods. So the use of military methods to create order is a key feature of the kind of approach to establishing stability. And obviously the military is essential to this ideology of the promotion of great power Russia. And in some sense it's essential because Russia, unlike China, cannot really, apart from energy, is not really an economic power. So it has been showing its great power status by its capacity to exert its military, to deploy its military, to help allies like Assad in Syria, or to deflect further enlargement. So the military is at the core of the self-image of Russia as a great power. And that has meant, obviously, substantial investment in the military, still nothing in comparison to the United States or China, but nevertheless, a reversal of the decline of the military, which you saw in the 1990s. Under Yeltsin, you had a real problem with the military, lack of investment, sense of humiliation. Now the military is back in there. It's a profession of prestige. It's promoted positively as something to be proud of. And extended to that is this idea, because Russia is faced by these threats across all its boundaries, potential threats, existing or potential, across this enormous boundary. You have this current feature of debate about the need for mobilization. The problem with Russia is it can't mobilize when an issue occurs. It has to be ready for when something happens, because we don't know where the threats are going to come from. So we have to be a state which is in perpetual readiness, perpetual mobilization. And this means not just military mobilization, but across the state. All sectors of the state and society have to be prepared. And what you've seen happening recently, well, not recently, the last 5 or 6 years, under Putin, is testing of the preparedness of civilian sector. Our regional governors are trained effectively. What about the transport system? What about the economy? We talk now in Russia of the need to establish an economy which is security dominated, which is able to withstand things like sanctions, conflict. So a security dominated economy is at the core of this. So much greater, I know Vron was talking about the recent global Britain and integration. For Russia, mobilization is much more all-embracing. All sectors of society have to be prepared for the possibility of conflict. And in doing this, they're taking it from the Soviet model, a lot of continuity from the model. The Soviet model, some analysts have suggested, was a mobilization system, which was entirely geared to the potential for war, which for many people is why ultimately it was successful in the Second World War. Well, this kind of approach is being developed under Putin, the continuing preparation for war in all sectors. And that means mobilization of society. It's not just transport and ministry. It has to develop a psychology in which it is prepared to sustain conflict. And we've seen the extension of military patriotic education in schools, renewed emphasis, rather like in the Soviet period actually, renewed emphasis on the need for physical fitness, the promotion of all kinds of unofficial organizations which will promote these patriotic military ideas. The idea of a young army there, you see them marching through Red Square, volunteers, or young people encouraged to join these kind of military volunteer units, and all kinds of unofficial rather dubious in some sense, organisations like the Night Wolves, who claim to be champions of the state, and Putin regards them as his friends, these kind of unofficial militia type organisations. The Night Wolves are actually a set of bikers that go back to the 1980s, but they've been expanded and given funding under Putin. Also, this preparation of the population involves information war, the use of the media. A continuous emphasis in the media is about the government narrative of threat, of being ready, the hostility of the West. That's really pulled out a possibility of war, and that is reflected in novels. Very popular themes now in novels, in the cinema, is actually the possibility of war with the West. America starting the next war. In some senses, you feel like the population, at least on the face of it, is being prepared, being mobilized, if you like, for the possibility of conflict. Obviously, being critical, you would suggest that this patriotic mobilization also boosts the legitimacy of the system. It's useful to maintain support for the system, and it marginalizes opposition. It's very, very difficult to oppose Putin because you'll be labeled as a foreign agent or as unpatriotic. Finally, some conclusions. What they're aiming at, Gerasimov, who is the head of the armed forces, talks about the goal is to create a nation armed, a nation prepared, ready, not necessarily a nation in arms. I mean, he draws a distinction there. The idea is not everybody isn't going to be mobilized now, but they should be prepared. And what is happening with these thousands of exercises? We tend to talk about a few exercises on the borders with Ukraine, but there have been thousands of mini and large-scale exercises which have been undertaken over the last few years, testing readiness to see where there are weaknesses, etc. And what obviously one should assume, because this mobilization, militarization is taking place, that Russia is therefore necessarily a threat. In some senses, the mobilization has thrown up major weaknesses and problems in the system. And we shouldn't also think about an entirely passive population. There's, as we know, even in the Soviet period, an enormous gap between what the media is saying and what actually people are thinking. So one shouldn't assume, and a lot of resistance, say, to the military endeavor, difficulty of recruiting people to fight in the conscripts, etc. So there are weaknesses in this whole militarization system. And I think that's probably my 20 minutes, is it?
Thanks very much, Paul.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. So as I say, if we can keep questions till the end of the panel. And now I'd like to introduce Malak Mayet, and their paper is called The Arms Industry and UK Higher Education. Malak Mayet is the university's coordinator for Campaign Against Arms Trade and the previous co-chair for the Disabled Students Campaign in the National Union of Students. Their work within higher education focuses on understanding divestment and demilitarization from a decolonial lens, and how the violence of militarism intersects with other modes of systemic oppression. And on that note, Malak, if you're ready, I will pass over to yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Wally. So I wanted to begin my talk by, I guess, describing the current political landscape of British higher education. And for me, two things really come to mind that really kind of encompass the state of higher education currently. And the first is, of course, the kind of topic that's on everyone's minds, COVID-19, thinking about how students were still expected to pay their tuition fees and their rent for student halls, the kind of abject refusal from many institutions to provide refunds for student hall rent, as well as the general callousness that a lot of institutions treated their students with. And this led to kind of a consequential occupations and rent strikes that we've seen across the year. And the second thing that comes to mind for me is the current free speech battle that we're seeing on campus. And I think just within the last month, the government has essentially affirmed the right of fascists to have a platform, and that's now essentially legally mandated for British universities, whilst we witness kind of record numbers of overwhelmingly ethnically minoritized student activists being reported to prevent duty or being subjected to student union or university disciplinary procedures for engaging in activism, namely against the arms trade and namely in kind of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And these two examples for me, as I said, encompass really the neoliberal dystopia that is higher education. And it's not surprising to me that this coincides with the 2011 coalition government and the subsequent drainage of state resources into higher education, as higher education has essentially become business enterprises rather than places of education. And students are no longer seen as students, but as paying customers. And whilst the arms trade might seem a long way off from the kind of topics I've just discussed, there is a crucial link, and that is the link of neoliberalism and universities' insistence on prioritizing profit over people. In 2021, I think it's common knowledge that British universities have historical links with both colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Glasgow University pledged to pay £20 million in reparations after discovering historical links with the slave trade in 2019. And All Souls College at Oxford paid £100,000 2 years earlier in recognition of funding received from slave owner Christopher Codrington. The University of Oxford still has a statue of Cecil Rhodes, the man responsible for the colonization of South Africa and the subsequent neo-imperialist exploits within that region through the diamond trade. The manufacture and trade of weapons was crucial to the success of colonial invasion historically and today, where the arms trade is directly responsible for the desecration of large parts of the Middle East, as well as ensuring instability through conflict and corruption throughout the global South by selling weapons to corrupt and tyrannical governments. Whilst the opaque nature of the arms trade and the increasing opacity of universities in relation in particular to their financial portfolios makes calculating top-line figures extremely difficult, we know the link that this has to higher education, and it's quite a crude one. And it's simply multiple British universities have direct financial links with arms companies, resulting in millions of pounds of funding and research investment. And in addition to that, universities will often host arms companies, and arms companies will use British campuses as a site of recruitment through things like careers fairs and talks and stuff like that they do through generally in the engineering departments. And yeah, speaking of engineering departments, these financial partnerships are most obvious at institutions that have engineering departments. And these departments are often majority or entirely funded by arms companies and then the Ministry of Defence. But it's not just kind of scientific universities or engineering departments that are the problem. Liberal arts institutions are also complicit. And I think the best example of this is Goldsmiths University of London, which is an institution that is internationally renowned for its research into social justice, but it still invests in the arms trade, firstly through lecturers' pensions, and then secondly, it has an investment portfolio of around £99,000, and that's with Israel alone. And Israel is one of the world's leading arms exporters. But in addition to recruiting platforms and research investment, universities also serve another purpose for the arms trade. The role of education, especially higher education, is inherently political. It reproduces and legitimizes a stratified social system and selects which young people it will integrate into the capitalist hierarchy. So through education, the arms trade is sanitized into a politically and morally neutral or even morally positive entity. And whilst universities hide behind arguments of apoliticism and legality, which in itself is a political position, the disregard universities have for the harm they commit globally is represented in the bleak reality of our campuses now. As hotspots for police brutality, transphobia, and rape culture, all of which I would argue is in many ways entirely legal. This coincides with a recent trend of universities willingly adopting decolonize initiatives, especially in relation to the curriculum. However, EDI initiatives, as progressive as they may be, are not and cannot be conflated with decolonization. The aim of the latter, in rudimentary terms, is to return colonized land and resources back to the indigenous peoples from whom it was stolen. EDI initiatives work to integrate marginalized people into existing colonial and capitalist structures without challenging the oppressive dynamics these institutions were built upon. Quite simply, if a university is invested in militarism, it's impossible for the same institution to claim a desire to decolonize. And as decolonization speaks to a material reality, not simply rhetoric, curriculums cannot be decolonized in isolation of wider democratization and divestment. I'll give the example of the University of Nottingham, which a few years ago started a decolonize campaign. And it's one of the many universities who released a Black Lives Matter statement last summer after the murder of George Floyd. University of Nottingham brands itself as a global university, whilst taking in just under £6 million of investment from the same arms companies responsible for global insecurity and destruction. They also started a Better Together branding campaign to draw light to microaggressions less than a year after students at the institution, who are overwhelmingly from marginalized backgrounds, were physically assaulted by BAE Systems private security for protesting their presence at a careers fair. Universities cannot continue to make empty hashtags, PR campaigns, and statements intending to address the societal ills reproduced on their campuses without grappling with the reality that their money funds these oppressions abroad via the arms trade. What does Black Lives Matter mean to an institution invested in the companies ensuring Black death globally? What meaningful stand can any institution take against police brutality when it allows for said brutality on their campuses? And what use is a consent campaign for a campus that refuses to acknowledge their participation in rape as a weapon of war? The struggle of students and staff in a neoliberal institution is shared with the peoples of the global South, resisting occupation, wars, and genocide. Universities must reckon with their pasts and their present, and we must refuse the commodification of our joint liberation through marketable EDI initiatives. Our education should be building a world that is safer and more secure, and our investment in militarism does the complete opposite.
Thank you, Malek, for a really compelling, thought-provoking paper, and we'll come back to questions at the end. But moving on, Claire Udi is the next paper up, and her paper is called Lived Experience of Marshall Portsmouth. Claire Udi is a master's student at the University of Portsmouth. Also, she is also an independent city councillor. Claire has managed to fund important LGBTQ services, which has changed the face of the provision in the city. She also founded the Portsmouth chapter of the mutual aid project Free My Meal, which to date has fed hundreds of families in poverty. So Claire, if you're ready, can I pass over to you?
Hi there, can you hear me? Because I haven't sound checked at all. Brilliant,
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'll be occasionally screen sharing. I've not done a presentation as such, but I've got windows to show you bits and pieces of. So hello, I'm Claire. It's lovely to be invited here today, and thank you. So I just want to talk about being from Portsmouth. I was born here 33 and a half years ago. And as many people who are born and raised in Portsmouth are aware, there are two things that you have an automatic right to when you are born. The first one is to love Portsmouth Football Club, obviously, but the second one is that you need to kind of love the Royal Navy and the forces. And there's a few reasonings around this. Number one is because in World War II, we massively suffered as a city in Portsmouth. Many of us will probably know someone who maybe died a few generations ago, or had family members, certainly like my grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, that we had direct descendants that fought during World War II. And therefore, our love for the forces is kind of ingrained in our soul, because we suffered so badly at the hands of Germany. A lot of our city was bombed. And as you can see, all the council housing in Portsmouth is because of the Great Rebuild that happened during social democracy. Also, we are the home of the Royal Navy, so it's literally on our doorstep. Everywhere we go, there is probably a reference to the forces absolutely everywhere, and definitely the Navy. We've obviously got a Royal Historic Dockyard as well. I have an issue because whilst I probably wouldn't define myself as a pacifist, the issue here is that I just don't particularly agree with the forces, and lots of people don't, but we're too scared to make that opinion kind of more public, because out of fear of retaliation. And last year I called out people defending statues, because apparently if you're doing it at 11 a.m. with a can of Stella in your hand, it doesn't look like you're really defending a statue. And then I spent that whole weekend getting rape and death threats because I made that opinion. But what we've done here in Portsmouth is kind of facilitated a narrative that is so strong that we're unable to counter it at all. And what I really want in this world is to organise and hope for people to come together and say, actually, I agree with your opinion. I don't want the forces to be part of colonisation, and I'm anti-interventionist, but I'm too scared to say that. So what do we do to do that? So I thought I'd do a little bits and pieces about what the Navy's up to right now. So hopefully if I share my screen and I click this and it's going to say Chrome, we could do that. So that should be coming up. You can see that, right? So just on the Telegraph, very obviously, this is yesterday, because we've got two very big aircraft carriers that are coming in, or have been coming in and out of Portsmouth recently. We're known in Portsmouth also to go watch boats come in and out of the dockyard. Apparently we have a cruise liner that's coming that's apparently bigger than the aircraft carriers soon. So I don't even know how that's even going to fit in our dockyard, because we have an incredibly small opening. But anyway, so Queen Elizabeth has gone off on a mission around the Mediterranean, and we'll go into India and stuff with some other people. It's like a task force or whatever. So my favourite headline here, very telling: on their days off, the Royal Navy know to have a blast. Brilliant, thank you, the Telegraph. But this is kind of reaffirming the narrative that these guys are doing great things whilst they're on a boat. They're going clay pigeon shooting, as you can see here. They're reaffirming their manliness down here because they went to play a rugby club where they won 44-0. So is this kind of like some masculinity supremacy here, where we're supporting strong sailors? Maybe, I doubt there is even any women here, and there are women in the forces. So my point is that I know it's the Telegraph, right? But we're still saying these guys are doing great things, when really we know what's happening around Italy. We've got tens of thousands of migrants a year coming over, and Italy aren't too great on wanting to support them that badly. And we're wholly dependent on human rights organisations saving these people, because people are drowning in their scores in the Mediterranean. So I'd like to know what the Navy are up to here. And part of me thinks they're probably not caring, because they're smashing people at rugby at the moment, having a great old time. But also the carriers that we have here as well in Portsmouth, and we've got the issue about the forces and climate change too. So the carriers make such a difference in Portsmouth when they're into our local emissions levels as well, that most of our poorest social housing is on the side of the city, which gets caught up in that. And naturally, it brings down all our how long we can live for. Life expectancy in that part of Portsmouth is 10 years lower than in the richer part of Portsmouth, and it's made even worse by the emissions that are held by these big grey boats. Also, I'd like to talk to you about the fact that we can't talk about the Navy in Portsmouth without talking about the Falklands. And I'm not going to show you this video. Hopefully you can see it, just a nod from anyone, just like this, the screenshot of the video. So this 40-minute video, thank you, Richard, hosted by Michael Burke of 999 fame, and saying about things coming home. So basically for the Falklands, I'm not going to explain the Falklands War to you, but basically setting off from Portsmouth and coming home from Portsmouth a few months later, it cemented Margaret Thatcher's power effectively and brought us together in more of a kind of patriotic way. I'm not sure about it, but everyone talks fondly about the Falklands, when my understanding, and it's like people enjoy having us own the Falklands. I've read all about it, but more of the fact that, have we tried to just colonise penguins at this point? Because I don't know why we're keeping control of an island that is 1,000 miles away. I'd kind of like to think that we'd only reasserted ourselves. I know that they were effectively invaded and there was nothing that we could do apart from kill them back. But at the same time, Argentina is a nation of white people, and I'd like to think if we had colonization of another country that was invaded, but it was owned, well, inherently originally owned by black or ethnic minority people, what would we do in that situation? Is the only reason why we fought back is because we were allowed to, because these people were inherently white. But anyway, Falklands happened and they came home, and I'm doing a bit of an Adam Buxton thing here when I'm going through the comments, and that one at the top I was going to ignore. My favourite one with the fuck, it said, is it just me or were people so much more polite and dignified then? And some people go patriotic now and fascism, okay, whatever. But this is my favourite comment of all time. Definitely there were no entitled rappers walking about with knives tucked in their puffer jackets. So we can understand these comments just by watching a simple video about the Falklands, about it returning home to Portsmouth. It was a massive homecoming, hundreds of thousands of people watching the boats coming home after the very short conflict, which we effectively won, and we reclaimed the land that was invaded. Lots of stuff here about national pride that you can see here, trying to restore some lost national pride, and some people trying to be intelligent and talk about, because obviously I'm not au fait too much with military terminology at all. Only stuff that I know that I read about. I like going to the Imperial War Museum. Like I said, I'm not really a pacifist. Look, I'm in Glasgow and I was crying with pride, lost a mate, and I'm really sorry for that, and fought on a ship to shoot them down. God, I'm proud. So he's sad that his friend died, but he got another fought on a ship and killed other people. So is this tit for tat? I don't know what the bargaining is. So we'll go on to now just very quickly so let's see if this works. If I unshare it, news share, this is it, photos. The other day that came up on my Facebook feed on my phone was Lockheed Martin. So we're surrounded, and Malik brought it up very briefly, about arms company divestment from universities, that we're surrounded by BAE Systems in a dockyard, obviously, as schools, and we've got Lockheed Martin up in haven't we? So this came up on my feed. The News Portsmouth is our local newspaper, and what apparently they're getting a paid partnership, and obviously they will, because they are private business, our local news, and it's gutter press as far as I'm concerned. But this is what the future of defence looks like, free in tomorrow's edition of the news. And obviously I didn't get the rest of it, 16 page. It must be a pull-out. Obviously that wasn't a front page, but just look at it. So you know who Lockheed Martin are, one of the biggest arms company in the whole entire world. And we are reinforcing the narrative. Look how cool that, I guess I want to say that's like an F-16 or something, and that helicopter next to it, stealth bomber, woo, look at it. It looks cool. We've seen things fly in the sky and we're like, that looks cool, right? But then we kind of have to realize the implications of that, of saying it's cool, and what they're actually going to do in the long run. my problem is with it here is that, like I said, they're literally selling arms and defence systems to massive countries, and yet we're supposed to be okay with this and read it in our local press. It's the biggest local press circulation in Portsmouth. It's the paper that everyone probably buys. They probably don't anymore because it's like a quid. It used to be 30 pence 20 years ago. And it goes back to the fact that Portsmouth News last year, I don't have the front page, BAE Systems sponsored the 50 most influential, helpful people in Portsmouth through the COVID pandemic or something similar. And it's like, and sponsored by BAE Systems. BAE Systems also sponsored quite heavily one of our last Pride event that we had here 2 years ago. I made a point of calling that out, and I've promised Portsmouth Pride since that I would find the relevant money to fund them with, so we can never go back to them funding. Tom, who helped organise this conference today, talks about woke washing, and BAE Systems are mostly guilty, like 1,000,000% guilty of that. So I'm just reading my thing. So I wanted to just briefly, well, as I come into like conclude about what I want to say in general, I don't really want to bring up the culture war really, but I want to theorise that the culture war has already been lost by us woke people, I suppose, because the seeds have been sown for the culture war for a very long time. I think post-social democracy, when we did the Great Rebuild and we had the NHS come in, everything was fine and dandy for about 30 seconds. And then we realised, well, the government and the establishment realised that we'd entered like massive debt post-World War II. The economic system as we knew it was failing because we were going to just go into neoliberal capitalism and into late capitalism. And therefore the seeds were sown by the establishment and by the media organisations in order to change our minds very subtly, obviously cultural hegemony and all that. And it started with saying that the unions wanted too much in the 70s. And then obviously in the 80s, we had right to buy and things like that. And we had the Falklands happen, and it reinforces our patriotism. The only thing I'm ever patriotic about is about Eurovision, unfortunately, which we never win anymore. So as we come down to it, these little bits in the media over years and years and years, and especially when we think about Section 28, about not teaching about LGBTQ people in school, in education in schools, which directly affected me because I was educated in the 90s, affected a lot of my friends as well. Happened during a massive pandemic called the AIDS crisis, which people seem to forget about when we talk about pandemics in general, is that these seeds have been sown. So now when people call it the culture wars, it's not a war, it was a battle that we had already lost, because the harder we tried to fight it, the more we come across kind of threats of violence and natures like that. So what do we want to do? I am not too sure about it, because I've tried to fight it on my own and I don't think we can do anything. And obviously I'm not advocating violence with this little meme of Arthur, but what I think we can do is take it out of context and talk about solidarity. What I've seen in Portsmouth very recently is that people are trying to stand up to the narrative, and especially around the forces and about how they operate, especially in the lives of Black Lives, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter, when we talk about decolonisation and abolition and things like that, is that there's more people and there's more activists that are coming to the surface. In Portsmouth recently, we had hundreds turn up for a Black Lives Matter event in Portsmouth last year. And as a socialist in Portsmouth who's been involved with X, Y, and Z for the last 6-7 years, and doesn't get people coming to meetings whatsoever. Like, I have never seen so many people at a protest. And it means there are people out there, and it's being reaffirmed by the Reclaim These Streets, where we still had hundreds turning out for those events. And very recently, when we took to the streets over very serious actions that are happening in Palestine right now, is that what we've noticed is that we've had more people from ethnic minorities joining us on the streets, because our movements are very white dominated in Portsmouth, if you could agree with that. And we had scores of people coming out for a Palestine protest. So there are people out there, but it's kind of getting them all into one place. And maybe the dream is maybe to open an autonomous zone in Winston Churchill Avenue, maybe one day. But I think coming together and having lots of people say, because it's not even kind of changing the narrative. Saying that you don't agree with the forces is just an opinion. It is not an extreme opinion, but it has been framed in such a way that if you said something like that, and especially in Portsmouth, that it is almost treasonous, that you can't get away with saying it whatsoever. So what we need is more people to come forward and say, we're going to do it. We're going to say these things, but if not, and all else fails, maybe Arthur over here with his little gas mask on might prove worthy. But that's me done, I think. Sorry if I ranted on too long, but thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Another really interesting paper. And I just to begin and to move into the questions, I'd like to really thank all three speakers for a really diverse, thought-provoking, fascinating set of papers, raising so many different issues, I think. So hopefully plenty of opportunity now for some discussion. And I'm already seeing a hand up from Stephen. So perhaps if we could just get straight into it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks to all three speakers, actually. They're all really interesting presentations. Yeah, great. Question for Paul, really, which is just about, well, obviously you were talking about Russian public discourse and militarized public discourse. You know, in Britain, the channel that I sometimes manage to watch here, which communicates some of that discourse, is RT. And I just wondered, what are the differences between the kind of discourse that you're talking about within Russia and what we're given internationally, whether it's in Britain or the United States or other countries where RT is broadcast? You know, how different is what we're talking? It doesn't seem to me that we get the same kind of militarized, for obvious reasons, really, the kind of hard military sell that Russians are obviously getting within Russia. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's a kind of subtle difference there. I think RT is much more, well, subtle in terms of trying to integrate with the way we present itself as a kind of bona fide independent news channel, rather than being obviously trying to put over a line. I'm not saying, you know, internal Russian, I mean, there's a danger in the West also to assume that you've got a kind of Stalinist control over the media in Russia. There is discussion, there are not independent, but a kind of semi-independent media outlets in Russia. But it is true to say that kind of there is a dominant narrative, which isn't as explicitly put over by RT. I mean, having said that, as I was thinking about that, I mean, we suggest that Russia has a dominant narrative. I mean, I find myself as a sort of, I'm often labeled as a Putin versteher, someone who excuses Putin. There is a dominant narrative in the West as well, which is absolutely difficult. If I go to a conference and I try to put over what I just now put over now, I'm tended to seen as, oh, you would say that because you're in the pay of Putin. There is also a dominant narrative in our own media, but you're right, there is a kind of difference between the narrative in the Russian media. It extends also in Russian media to discussion programs, not just straight media. There is an assumption about the West and about the United States, which doesn't come over in RT. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Louis, question from yourself.
Yeah, just a quick one. Malik and Claire, you're both dynamic young people with a lot to say and aware of various dynamics in the world and so forth. Your fellow young people, how do you sense their willingness to put their words and possibly even their bodies on the line for these kind of noble beliefs that you've talked about today? Do you sense, my personal sense being a lecturer and dealing with young people is that young people are ultimately quite right-minded and do see the world clearly and understand many of these dynamics and many of these flaws, but do you have a sense yourself from your peers, if they are willing to sort of take those next steps, be brave, put their voices out there in a world of social media critique and so forth?
I believe so. I think this speaks to the importance of having an understanding of liberation outside of kind of EDI, because I definitely think with the kind of recent, I guess, upsurgence of social media and activism becoming something that is in itself becoming commodified, holding what you've described as kind of righteous beliefs is often then seen as something that's lucrative. And actually, historically, holding the right opinions isn't lucrative. It's actually more of a matter of what are you willing to sacrifice to see those beliefs through. But I'm thinking about kind of the Kill the Bill protests that have been happening recently. They've been led by not just young feminists, also kind of feminists with a lot more kind of experience. But it is young people, and it is my generation that are getting arrested at protests, finding new ways to kind of get around securitization. A lot of the work that's been happening around prevent duty and the kind of, I guess, increasing of the surveillance state in relation to trade union activity and left-wing activism has been coming from a younger audience. And a lot of the research that's been done on that has been done, for example, by the National Union of Students. So I think that young people are willing to put things on the line for their vision of the world. But I do think that robust political education would get us to that point far quicker, because I definitely think that there is at least I definitely have the worry that as institutions and as corporations commodify liberation movements, Pride is a really good example of this, the way Pride has been commodified. We move away from activism that's transformative to, pinkwashing and wokewashing, essentially.
I 100% agree with what Malik says there. I think I'm willing to put myself on the line, and I have done for quite a few years now, and it is really incredibly hard on mental health. You need to be incredibly resilient, and alongside, and I'd love to have a robust political education, but I feel like sometimes I don't think that would ever happen under the government that we have right now. I feel like we're going to enter like another Section 28 just on trans people at the moment. I think there should be huge support networks amongst activists, definitely, to look after one another, resilience networks, if people want to put themselves on the front line. We've seen recently that more direct action has worked, obviously, with the occupation movement over the rents. Occupation movement in general works. Like I said, we should be doing that all the time. We absolutely should not be moving towards any form of violence, but we need to find better tactics in order to get our voices heard, and occupation is definitely one of those things. So yeah, my main thing would be to, once we found the people that want to get in, creating networks of resilience to help people so we can be on the front line. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any further questions for any of our three speakers? Perhaps while we're waiting, do either put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll keep an eye out. Maybe a question for Paul. Really interesting paper, and I was intrigued by, because you sort of mentioned film and pop culture and the ways in which these are sort of contributing toward a militarization of kind of Russian discourse at the time. And I have vague memories, and this might be completely wrong. And I think I was watching a documentary a while ago, and I think it might have been Stacey Dooley or someone, but she was talking about she went to Russia, and there was this sort of quite large group of young, hip sort of graphic designers and pop culture, sort of very loyal to Putin. And I just wondered if you had any sort of, to what extent, I guess, there is that sort of pop culture support for Putin and for his aims, and yeah, anything on that really. No.
Oh yes, I mean that's quite common. I mean there are kind of pop songs about there's that famous one. I want a man like Putin. You know about.
Okay, welcome back everybody to this Camouflaging Culture Symposium hosted by the University of Portsmouth, the Culture and Conflict Group actually within the CCI faculty of the University of Portsmouth to be proper about it. So I'm Tom Sykes, I'm a senior lecturer in creative writing at Portsmouth. My own research is a sort of mix of, I suppose, journalistic reporting on conflict type issues in Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines. And also more recently, I've been doing more sorts of academic analysis of Western discourses on the Philippines, which takes in genres that are probably quite relevant to our theme, such as boys' own colonial adventure novels from the sort of late 19th, early 20th centuries, but also much more contemporary reporting on that part of the world too. So we have a kind of bumper extra value panel for you because we've got 4 panelists this time, 2 of whom are going to be working together. Each of them have 15 minutes each, apart from Ollie and Louis, who have 20. We thought we'd give them some extra time because there's 2 of them working on the same thing. We thought that was fair. As before, I'll put a little 2-minute warning into the chat box for the speakers, just to let you know kind of when to start to think about finishing. As before, if the other members of the audience could save their questions until all 3 speakers have finished, you can type them into the chat box or you can speak them, that's fine. And I will introduce our first panelists, who are going to speak on their title of their paper is A War You Won't Believe, Rambo in Contemporary Cultural Politics. And this is Rambo as in the 80s action hero rather than the French symbolist poet. Sorry, that's a rubbish joke, isn't it? But there you go. So we have Ollie Gruner, who is a senior lecturer in visual culture at the University of Portsmouth. His research focuses on historical representations and cultural memory, especially the ways in which the 1960s have been portrayed in a range of media. He's the author of Screening the 60s, Hollywood Cinema and the Politics of Memory, which I can personally recommend hugely. It's a superb piece of work. And also is co-editor with Peter Kramer of Greece is the Word, Exploring a Cultural Phenomenon, which is with Anthem Press, and it's forthcoming, it'll be published soon. Ollie has also had essays published in the journals, the Historical Journal of Film, Radio and Television, Rethinking History and the Poster, as well as various edited collections. Shall I just introduce both of you now, or and then you can just take it away however you like. So we're also working with Ollie on this panel, or this presentation, is Louis Netter, who's a practicing illustrator with over 15 years of experience. His satirical illustration has been published in magazines and books, and his artwork is collected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Library of Congress, amongst other collections in the US. He has collaborated with Ollie for the Corbyn comic, Self-Made Hero. He holds a PhD from the Royal College of Art in reportage drawing and is exploring further practice-based research in comic as research projects following the publication of Steal This History in the journal Rethinking History, published by Taylor and Francis. Other practice-based research that Louis has done involves exploring community outreach and lived experience through art making in Nairobi slums, arts and resilience in South Sudan, and the factors that impact violence against women in Southeast Asia. So over to you guys.
Thanks very much, Tom, on behalf of Louis and myself. So yeah, we're going to split this paper just sort of 10 minutes each way. I'm going to start with just a little bit, and it is going to be largely the 80s incarnation of Rambo, although talking a little about his subsequent appearances as well. I'll just share my screen, and hopefully you can see that okay. Okay, so the year is 1943, and as war rages in the Pacific, a lone hero is dispatched to the Philippines on a top secret mission. His task, to rescue American soldiers being held in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. No ordinary draftee, the man about to single-handedly destroy an Axis stronghold is already a legend amongst his military peers. Quote, "You made quite a name for yourself in the Battle of Guadalcanal," gushes one fellow officer as the mission gets underway. And the person to whom this officer refers, the superhuman, highly skilled, muscle-bound machine about to wreak havoc on Tojo's imperial army, can be no other but John Rambo, ready to give the enemy, in his own words, a war they won't believe. This is at least apparently the Rambo story that many viewers in Syria would have encountered when pirated versions of the 1985 film Rambo First Blood Part 2 reached their borders. In this subtitled edition of the Sylvester Stallone action vehicle, all verbal references to the Vietnam War and Soviet Union were replaced by allusions to World War II. An attempt to avoid censorship from a Syrian regime that was on good terms with the Soviets, those involved in producing the pirate videos had even, according to one Hollywood executive, touched up the hats and the Vietnam War insignia on the video's front cover. This attempt at political translation is but one, albeit extreme, example of the ways in which Rambo, the films, and the character himself has been reinterpreted by a variety of arbiters. Indeed, for a man renowned for his tough stoicism in the face of enemy fire, John Rambo has proven surprisingly pliant over the years. Whether touted as a symbol of conservative Vietnam War revisionism, an overarching metaphor for aggressive foreign policy, a figurehead for right-wing extremists and paramilitary subcultures, or a talismanic icon in freedom struggles and international alliances, rarely does a war go by without the inevitable recourse to Rambo. It is the purpose of this paper to unravel some of the diverse meanings that have coalesced around the icon. Rather than focus specifically on singular film texts, this paper approaches the John Rambo character as a quasi-mythic touchstone in contemporary cultural politics. Myths, to paraphrase Levi Strauss, are good to think with, and they speak to and mediate ideological structures present within a particular context. And from at least the release of First Blood Part 2, Rambo has been used to think through, discuss, and debate issues of political import. While the common reading of Rambo as conservative tub thumper, certainly and will very definitely become clear as a key interpretive frame, but we argue that they does not do full justice to his scattered presence across US culture. In order to address this, our paper is split into two parts, and I'll begin with a very brief overview of some of the historical political contexts, and then Louis will provide a detailed reflection on his own personal engagement with the icon. So in December 2016, newly elected President Donald Trump was in the midst of assembling political allies to head up institutions across the US. Many considered his selection of Sylvester Stallone for chair of the National Endowment of the Arts idiosyncratic, even by Trump standards. In the end, Stallone politely refused the NEA chair, telling the New York Daily News that, quote, "I'm incredibly flattered to have been suggested, but I believe I could be more effective in bringing national attention to returning military personnel." Intentional or not, however, Trump's approach and Stallone's response dredged up the ghosts of conflicts past, harking back to culture wars over the NEA and over the military, so central to 1980s and 90s US public political discourse. Indeed, the Trump-Stallone affair served as a reminder of how imbricated the actor, and by extension, his filmic alter ego, had become in a wider militarization of US culture. Ramboism, Rambo heroics, a Rambo mentality, these and similar phrases have long pervaded media accounts of bellicose foreign policy decisions. And President Reagan's infamous quip that after viewing First Blood Part 2, he knew what to do next time about real hostage situations sparked a veritable avalanche of cartoons and commentaries intended to present the president and his allies and successors in a less than flattering light. Given the thematic content of First Blood and First Blood Part 2, it is unsurprising that debates on the Vietnam War would mark Rambo's first foray into the public sphere, remembering Vietnam, as Marita Sturkin, H. Bruce Franklin, Jerry Lembuk, among many others, have amply demonstrated, saw fact and fiction, myth and history, and personal memory become entangled. Diverse groups and individuals sought to shape memory of the war for their own ideological ends. For example, politically conservative commentators spoke of the continued incarceration of US soldiers in Vietnamese prisoner of war camps and lamented memories of Vietnam veterans being literally spat at by anti-war protesters. And there is a paucity, if any, hard evidence to corroborate either of these stories. Lembuk, for example, trawls through numerous documentary materials looking for discussions of veterans being spat at by the anti-war movement. Can't find any other than a few anecdotes, and nonetheless these memories served as useful rhetorical bludgeons for conservatives hoping to demonize the 60s anti-war movement and communist states in order that they could push for a more aggressive foreign policy. Certainly, Rambo has been argued to mediate this broader cluster of discourses. When First Blood was received reasonably warmly on its initial release, after the appearance of the sequels, the very term Rambo was often used in the media to signify a coherent ideology, whether discussed in terms of right-wing politics or referenced as inauthentic foil to other war representations, like Oliver Stone's 1986 drama Platoon. Rambo, at least his filmic incarnations, was and is often treated as a sinister spectre of action nonsense past. In one of the more chilling accounts of Rambo's cultural impact, James William Gibson notes his significance to a right-wing paramilitary subculture that emerged in the 70s and 80s. According to Gibson, Rambo was the emblem of the movement, one that through hyper-macho posturing, which often spilled over into extreme violence, was concerned with reasserting the primacy of the mythical lone warrior and reversing what it perceived to be America's fall from grace since the end of Vietnam. And certainly film scholars have sought to question whether the Rambo films are entirely conservative and pro-Reagan, and we could certainly, if we had time, sort of look at the extra materials around it and the novelizations and so forth, and these attempts to struggle against this overwhelming presentation of Rambo as a sort of conservative icon. But certainly the idea of political ambiguity is interesting. For firstly, its appeal to a range of different taste formations, but also because it would seem to have had a knock-on effect on the ways in which Rambo was discussed in other contexts. And on this, I just want to emphasize that these reports now are all still coming from the US, from a sort of a Anglophone media. In April 1987, under the headline Rambo as Subversive, the National Review ran a story about First Blood Part 2's presence in Ceausescu-run Romania. Rambo is making his presence felt as an anti-government force, the article explained. His name is being scrawled on walls, and his film cassettes are in heavy demand among the viewers of black market VCRs in this most isolated and retrogressive communist country. In a Reuters article syndicated across the United States, it was noted that the same film was popular with audiences in Lebanon. Muslim filmgoers, according to the report, identified with Rambo's courage, his frightened prowess, and his anger at being let down by the government. Time and again, articles on Rambo have dwelled on his appeals to victims of unpopular governments. Inevitably, given Rambo 3's focus on the Mujahideen's battle against occupying Soviet forces, the film was reported to be very popular in this country. Pirate copies were apparently available in the thousands just 1 month after its US release. It is interesting to note that such coverage often reframed Rambo not as the phony suggested to have greeted American audiences, but a larger-than-life symbol of identification for oppressed peoples around the world. Jump forward 10 years and Afghanistan was once again reported to be a welcome host for the Rambo films. This time Rambo was touted as symbolic rebellion against the Taliban. The Washington Post and Philadelphia Inquirer, for example, explained the film's popularity on pirate video. More recently, Rambo's popularity in Burma or Myanmar has received attention. Stallone and others involved in the production of Rambo 4, which saw him fight alongside Karen rebels against the country's military junta, attempted at the time to promote the film's humanitarian credentials. The Wall Street Journal noted that the junta had ordered all local media to run negative reviews of the movie. And while such reports on the surface suggest potential ways in which diverse audiences interpreted the Rambo character, it would be problematic to view them in this light. In many ways, the reports functioned as an opportunity on the part of the US media to, as it were, have its cake and eat it. That is, no self-respecting critic or commentator would overtly celebrate Rambo, but in emphasizing his role in other countries, they're able to subtly and perhaps inadvertently promote film and US media in general as a force for good. Barbara Klinger notes a similar phenomenon taking place with regard to media coverage of the 1999 film Titanic's reception in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Here was another film derided by critics, but one which had garnered enormous underground cachet in this country. Klinger suggests that such reports largely elided the potential for multiple readings of the film and instead made more generalized points about cinema's positive impact on freedom struggles. More recently, and coming to a close, is notable that even in countries like the US and UK, the Rambo figure has been sympathetically reframed as an anti-establishment hero, especially in film reworkings of the Rambo myth. The 2007 coming-of-age comedy Son of Rambo focuses on how a single viewing of First Blood causes young Will Proudfoot, played by Ben Milner, to rebel against his strict Plymouth Brethren upbringing and against socially accepted norms more generally. With this example in mind and conscious of time, I'd like to pass over to Louis to develop the theme of personal engagements with Rambo.
Thank you, Ollie. Let me just do this here. When the credits rolled on Rambo First Blood Part 2 at Triangle Cinema in Yorktown Heights, New York, my father turned to me and said, "That was possibly the worst decision I have made as a parent." The film was rated R, which is restricted to 17-year-olds or those accompanied by a parent or guardian. I was 10 and a rabid Rambo fan. In fact, a large part of my late childhood was spent playing out war games with Rambo, Schwarzenegger, and G.I. Joe playing a significant part. Rambo, however, was the best. My friends and I had purchased our own mail-order survival knives through some dodgy Freedom Soldier magazine, of which there were many in the local stationery shop. Fortunately for us, ours didn't come sharpened, and we were pretty sure it was smaller than Rambo's. We also each had a plastic Kalashnikov, which we buzzed while running around debating whether our shots were dead kills. We weren't consciously killing commies, but we were damn enthusiastic about the machinery of war. So why did Rambo hold the top spot? For one, like Schwarzenegger, he didn't fuss with much talk. His monosyllabic communication was just enough to confirm steely-eyed focus on the mission. His tan, sweaty, rippled muscles quivered in the dappled jungle sun, and you wanted to be him. And unlike Schwarzenegger, whose dialogue was always tinged with absurdity, Rambo meant business. It was all over his face. He was like a big cat. Rambo represented the times. The Cold War was essentially quite boring. Lots of potential action and destruction, but most of the time it was like watching a tense chess match with nuclear weapons sliding into different squares. Many wanted more action, more proxy wars, more threats, even nuclear strikes. It was a society that held great tension, but also pranced around in leg warmers, drinking the latest marketing concoction of new Coke or Diet Pepsi with a twist of lime. As a kid during this time, it was all about war movies, a proper Hollywood brainwashing. They weren't going to wait for the Cold War to get hot. They got on with the action. Rambo, Missing in Action, Commando, Red Dawn, the list goes on and on. Somehow, in all these films, the heroes were alone, as Ali mentioned, abandoned by their governments and left to fight with their wits, some machine guns, and a seemingly endless supply of bullets. Fortunately for them, their adversaries had terrible aim. The restless warmongers of that era reared their ugly heads in the second Bush administration, but Rambo, that steaming pile of man meat, was always ready to do his work. But what work? The work of his masters, his country? No, he was the true moral crusader of America. A parasitic myth. Seeing it clear-eyed, its flaws are numerous and regularly proven false. It was a myth propagated through images and clearly for the young. A message of, don't worry, boys, your time will come, seem to be emitted through the tantalizing action and adventure of grown men ducking, diving, and firing. Before boys want to be with girls, they want to be men. We were being shown the path to manhood by men who struggled to complete sentences. Okay, whoop. Oliver Wendell Holmes notes, the production of images also furnishes a ruling ideology. Social change is replaced by a change of images. The freedom to consume a plurality of images and goods is equated with freedom itself. The narrowing of free political choice to free economic consumption required the unlimited production and consumption of images. So maybe Rambo's righteous fight for freedom isn't about America's moral purpose, or even when it's difficult to do so. It is a double bluff, an elaborate lie set up to convince the American public that they have agency, that the Rambos out there are always fighting for them because America is bestowed with clarion vision, untarnished by culture. Rambo, who in First Blood Part 2 risked everything for a few half-dead vets and ended up with a somewhat problematic confrontation with a pencil pusher who just didn't get it. At the end of the film, Rambo utters his few complete sentences in a highly dramatic close-up. He responds to the comment by his former sergeant, "The war and everything that happened here may have been wrong, but damn it, don't hate your country for it." Rambo says, "Hate? I'd die for it." "Then what is it you want?" "I want," heavy breathing, "what they want. And every other guy who came over here who spilt his guts and gave everything he had wants. For our country to love us as much as we love it." Pregnant and very long pause. "That's what I want." And then he walks off as if he just delivered the Gettysburg Address. So the double bluff is that the renegade Rambo is actually just a sucker who didn't get enough government cuddles when he got back after Vietnam and takes his frustration out on low-level soldiers in the jungles of Asia, long after the aforementioned pointless war took place. Rambo descends into meaningless like so many other figures of that era. Baudrillard regularly pointed out that America always exploited the dream and the myth for its own causes, whether they be political, social, or economic. For Baudrillard, it was a way of tenuously holding the idea of America together. Otherwise, it would sink into the grim burden of its own existence. He notes, as for American reality, even the face-lifted variety retains its vast scope, its tremendous scale, and at the same time, an unspoilt rawness. All societies end up wearing masks. Why not the mask of Reagan, or Rambo, I say? But what remains intact is what was there at the beginning, space and the spirit of fiction. Rambo and his sexed up vision of war still permeates American culture. While America claims to be a culture of now, it is dogged by cowboy paranoia, provincialism, religiosity, and a love of big guns. It is difficult to participate in a culture of total excess and maintain pectoral muscles like Sylvester Stallone. Fortunately, the fictional icons of American bravado will always be there to remind Americans in their ever-fraught race to the top, we ain't got time to bleed. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of a Dead Kennedys song. Can you see this? Nope, you probably can't.
No, not.
Okay, you will now. Hold on.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm just going to, this is a Dead Kennedys song called Rambozo the Clown. Okay, Cabbage Patch Terrorist is pretty good. I like that. But I think that's, I'll end on that one. You can, enjoy that song in your own time.
Thanks very much, Louis and Ollie. Superb. I will now go and introduce our next speaker, Matt Alford. His talk is entitled "We Need to Talk About the Conversation." Matt's PhD thesis applied Noam Chomsky's propaganda model to contemporary Hollywood, and his subsequent research similarly concerns the representation of Western power. Matt's first documentary film, The Writer with No Hands, 2014, examined a conspiracy theory about the death of a Hollywood screenwriter. His second documentary, Theatres of War, 2021, is distributed worldwide by the Media Education Foundation. The film is based on his co-authored book, National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood, which came out in 2017, and draws on archival and interview gathering trips to Los Angeles and Washington, DC. So whenever you're ready, Matt. I think you're muted.
What a surprise. I usually talk about film and politics, the politics of film. So the Rambo presentation by Ollie and Lewis was really interesting to me. Today, I'm not going to talk about film directly, although I would just note in the spirit of Rambo, if you want to see a film which is kind of ideologically even worse than Rambo, it's currently out in the cinema, starring the guy from Better Call Saul, Bob Odenkirk, and it's a film called Nobody, and it's quite interesting. I watched it a couple of days ago, and it's the same sort of thing, kind of vengeance fantasy as, you know, Taken and Rambo and that, but without really any justification. Like there's not even the kind of token like the bad guys came for us first sort of thing. Like it's as thin a rationalization for extremely sadistic violence that you could possibly imagine, and it's also kind of and it makes jokes, very weak sort of jokes about it all the time, kind of the idea that the only thing that can make any of the characters happy in the whole film is to initiate mass sadistic violence, and nothing else makes them happy in any way. I mean, now that I think about it, I'm wondering if it might be a brilliant art piece, but I think no. I think it's just a morally bankrupt movie, probably the worst I've ever seen. I didn't walk out though, because I thought that I might be needed as a witness at some point. It was that bad a piece of work. The title of my talk today, I'll talk for about 10 minutes, I think, is "We Need to Talk About the Conversation." And that is a good title that we came up with, although it's not entirely representative of what I'm actually going to talk about either. The Conversation is an online newspaper, online publication, which I'm sure probably you all know, and maybe some of you have written for as well. And I wrote, or I should say, I wrote in a team of people a couple of years ago, a piece for The Conversation, which was abruptly pulled, and it was pulled undeniably purely for political reasons. And so me and that team decided to write about that experience. And one of the reasons we did was because it was particularly ironic that the content of our article that we wrote for The Conversation, that we pitched to The Conversation, was about what things do the mainstream media not allow you to say in the mainstream media. And this was particularly applying the theoretical work of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, which again, I suspect you have some familiarity with. Chomsky has since the 1960s written about the things that are omitted from the representation of Western foreign policy, and a lot about Vietnam, obviously, but then all the other American interventions into the 80s in Panama and in El Salvador, and then onto Iraq and so on. But we had noticed that the that obviously, as Chomsky himself has aged, he's now 93, he had done less formal work. So it struck us that we could do a piece that updated in a very accessible way update some of his case studies and reinforce and repackage in very, very clear, succinct journalistic style his ideas. So we went about doing that. We approached the conversation. Obviously, no other newspaper would touch this at all, or magazine, because Chomsky's work is comes from an anarchist perspective, and all the main liberal newspapers, including the Guardian and Independent, and all the others, tend to be really quite shy of that critique, particularly as that critique is often highlighting the media's complicity in promoting or at the very least failing to critically evaluate the Western role in causing a lot of death and destruction. So we put together a piece which was looking at a series of so the conversation seemed to be a good publication to try. We didn't really think that we were going to get anywhere with it, to be honest with you, because we thought, you know, they're probably part of the same ideological way of being. But they surprisingly said yes. They were keen to have our article, and we worked closely with the conversation, and they were actually very, very good working with us. They, if you ever write for them, they have software that basically can determine how straightforward, you could say simplistic, but actually I quite like it, to be honest with you, how straightforward your writing is, so that you're writing in a really clear journalistic way. And they also work with you with they provide you with an editor, so that it's, you know, that they have that kind of professional experience to put together impactful articles. We were all happy with it. We had we got to the point where we had an article that was talking about things like, I mean, we did mention the Iraq War, but relatively limited on that. But a lot about Syria, a lot about Egypt, a lot about Libya, and several of those interventions, and particularly about the way that reporting tended to be very favourable and positive about countries that we support, dictatorships that we support, including Saudi Arabia, for example. We got to the stage where they were literally within a few minutes of publishing the piece, and they'd come up with the editor had come up with an amazing headline, which was how Western media supports state terror while millions die, with a picture of an American soldier on a gun turret, on a tank, a Bradley tank, I think it was. I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen in my life a newspaper headline as much representing the Chomskyan perspective in my life, and it would have been a quite shocking article, I think, in the way that it was packaged, and I think it would have been brilliant. But they then had a final check from the executive editor of the conversation, and within an hour we were called to say that there was a problem and that there was a delay. We said, fine, okay, we'll continue to work on this in any way that you want. And the problem and delay basically meant that they removed all references. When they say it was a problem and delay, it was really, that's their polite way of saying, we're not touching this with a barge pole, go screw yourself. In the way that they had handled the document, the shared document, was to remove any reference to our own scholarly experience or skill base in propaganda theory, to remove any reference to Vietnam, to remove any reference to East Timor and the Indonesian dictatorship's invasion of East Timor. Bear in mind, these are things that are 50 years old. They removed any reference to Venezuela. and just generally gutted the article. There were various comments in there that were all in caps, as you can imagine, with things like, we have to criticize Colonel Gaddafi in here, put in a line about Colonel Gaddafi, and similar things like that. So we continued to work on the piece with this very sympathetic and nice editor who was working with us, but it just fell apart over the following weeks, and it was clear that the editor didn't have any control over what was happening because the executive editor had intervened. We then maybe I should just pull back for 1 minute and just say, why am I telling you this? I think partly just because it's an interesting illustration of the propaganda model at work, an interesting illustration of what the ideological limits are of what can be said in the press. To actually criticize Western foreign policy is extremely difficult. I mean, I kind of thought for a long time, I'm 43 now, I thought for most of my life, even though I was very much agreed with the Chomsky propaganda model, I sort of thought that if you had a bit of luck and you wrote the right thing in the right way, and you maybe had a contact and had a bit of an in, you could probably get a few really good pieces of work into the mainstream. And I just don't believe that at all now. I think it'd have to be an extraordinary circumstance to actually have material that genuinely criticizes and highlights in a systematic way the economic and narrow political interests of the ruling establishment within war. So just to complete the story, I'm never quite sure how to tell this story, but to complete the story, we then took that piece to Peace News, and I think Milan Rai is here, and we told that story. We didn't at the time name the conversation. That was my request and decision to our group, because I didn't really know what the implications were of any of that. But a couple of months ago, I decided to repackage the whole thing and rewrite the article and add in a lot of new information and then name the conversation, because I realized, after having spoken to legal people, that it was okay to do so. So yeah, I mean, what's the take-home message from this experience? Yeah, I guess when I say that the title is slightly misleading about the we need to talk about the conversation, I think my view has always been that our experience here was a typical experience of what happens when you work with the mainstream media on anything, on any kind of radical critique of foreign policy. So I didn't really see the conversation itself as being particularly different in that regard. I always thought it was a lesson in the media as a whole. And I'm not making any particular claim that the conversation is a particularly evil thing or anything like that. So in a way, I'm not talking about the conversation. Also, it was quite hard to find information, to find other cases of where people have been, where their work has been deliberately stymied by those editors. Now, we have found some of those. In fact, Stephen Harper is in the audience here, and he's had a similar experience where a piece was one of his pieces was pulled. I hope, Stephen, you don't mind me saying, because we have written about it briefly in the piece before. His case is almost as stark as ours, but there was less of a paper trail, which was that he wrote an article critiquing Donald Trump's bombing of Syria. It was abruptly pulled, and then the next day, a military figure, I won't name that person, a very pro-military person, basically said, this is the first and only good thing that Donald Trump's done, and that's what went out in the conversation the following day. I have not conducted a systematic study of the conversation's output on foreign policy. It is, from what I can see and judge, it is about as good or as bad, however you want to see it, as, say, The Guardian or The Independent. But I think it is to say that it is probably not better than those in terms of pursuing peace, and certainly it has an editorial stance that is very willing to prevent the kind of I'm not a veteran, obviously, but I'm very supportive of Veterans for Peace, for example, which have already been mentioned, and that perspective seems to be shut down pretty well. I suppose I'd just say one other thing is that we did hear from Chomsky himself about this article on 2 or 3 different occasions. Have I got a couple of minutes, Tom? I actually didn't look at the clock at all.
You've got about half a minute, but should we say a minute as a compromise?
No, it's absolutely fine. I was clueless on. I didn't look at the clock. So the final thing I'd say is that we began the piece by talking about how in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, the whole idea was that that the United States was there to protect the South, protect South Vietnam. But Chomsky was the only person, the only voice in the 1960s saying, as early as 1962, well, we're fighting the South, we're destroying the South, we're not barely even fighting the North, we're destroying it. So, and by the end of the war, 2/3 of the bombs had actually been dropped on the South. So it was one of these things where this groupthink had it that there was that the war was for a completely, totally opposing, 180-degree opposing thing of what actually happened. Chomsky got back to us and he said, "This is, in short," he said, "in one word, it's maddening, and I'm still shocked by this after 60 years." I thought it was a really interesting final comment that he made a few weeks ago. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. Very, very intriguing. And you mentioned Stephen, and we're so slick in our transitions here that we have Stephen next. So his talk is going to be called Girls on a Mission, Feminism, Humanitarianism and the War on Terror in Our Girl, BBC 2013 to present. Stephen is Senior Lecturer in the School of Film, Media and Communication, also here at the University of Portsmouth. His research interests include the mediation of mental health and film and television representations of war. He's the author of numerous journal articles, book chapters and edited collections on these and other subjects, and is the author of 3 books, Madness, Power and the Media, Beyond the Left, The Communist Critique of the Media and Screening Bosnia. And I can also recommend those last 2 books because I've read them and they're very good. I can also recommend Matt's book. Probably seems like I've been stalking our panelists. I just know them and I read their stuff and I can recommend all their work. So take it away, Stephen. Thanks. Sorry, before you start, can I just, there seems to be a kind of quite annoying humming noise coming from somewhere. Can people just make sure that if you're not speaking, just...
I think it might be me, Tom. Sometimes my computer does make a funny sound, so I'm going to mute myself, okay? Can you let me know?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks, Matt. All right. Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
That's all right. Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides, okay? Everybody, thumbs up, good. All right, well, I'm just gonna, you'll forgive me for this, my presentation won't be as fluid as the other ones. I'm going to read just to try and get through things fairly quickly. So, written by Tony Grounds and first broadcast in 2013, Our Girl is a primetime BBC TV drama about a combat medical technician. The first series starred former EastEnders actress Lacey Turner as Private Molly Dawes. There she is on the left of the screen. A working class girl who swaps a frustrating existence in the East End of London for life in an all-male section of the British Army based in Afghanistan. In 2016, the second series introduced former Coronation Street actress Michelle Keegan in the lead role of Lance Corporal Georgie Lane, another army medic. Keegan returned for the drama's 3rd and 4th series, which focused on disaster relief and anti-terror operations in Afghanistan, Nepal and Nigeria. Our Girl cuts between domestic plot lines such as wedding day jiltings and scenes of mortal peril in far-flung trouble spots, mixing the cosy conventions of soap opera with the grainy realism of the grunt film, and recycling the visual iconography of the War on Terror from mid-evening militainment. And what I want to do in this just very brief and simple textual analysis really is to consider Our Girl as an example of primetime propaganda, exploring the tension between its ostensibly progressive gender politics and its implicit support for British imperialism. And with that in mind, I want to focus on three aspects of the drama. Number one, its appeal to feminist and women's rights discourse. Two, what I'm going to call its paranoid patriotism. So this is the means by which the drama sorts those who belong from those who don't. And finally, its recuperation or neutralization of critique. So, Our Girls and Theirs, this is the first section. As the film scholar Yvonne Tasker noted a decade ago, military women on screen have often been depicted as auxiliaries or problematic presences. And there remains a widespread opinion that women are not really soldiers, to use Tasker's phrase. This anxiety about the status of military women is apparent in Our Girl. The word girl itself, of course, arguably implies social inferiority, as do the diminutive endings of the heroines' names, Molly and Georgie. And the drama's protagonists must prove their worth to sceptical or sexist male colleagues. In fact, Our Girl belongs to the popular British TV subgenre pioneered by Linda LaPlante and others in the 1980s, the women in a man's world drama, depicting women's struggle for acceptance within male-dominated institutions. Molly Dawes and Georgie Lane's life courses, meanwhile, follow a liberal feminist trajectory. Both women reject married life in Britain in favour of adventurous careers in the global south, becoming inspirational humanitarians in the process. In series one, there are repeated reminders that Western forces are in Afghanistan to help local children get to school. One of these children is Bashira, who is being beaten by her father and is already promised in marriage. Appalled at Bashira's plight, Dawes determines to rescue the girl from her fate, despite repeated discouragements from her superior, Captain James. Female British soldiers rescue a young girl again in series 3, when Lane and another female medic prevent a Nepalese village girl from being trafficked and sold into prostitution. The Bashira storyline in particular recalls the real-world case of the Pakistani schoolgirl Malala Yousafzai, who became a worldwide news phenomenon in 2012 after being shot by the Taliban on her way to school. In the words of Edwards and Shakul, 2015, Yousafzai was framed in Western news media as a victim of a society largely hostile to women and a beacon of hope for girls in a highly restrictive society. Our Girl focuses on the role of Western women in rescuing these endangered girls, adding a feminist twist to the familiar white savior narrative. Instead of white men saving brown women from brown men, in Gayatri Spivak's infamous phrase, Our Girl depicts Western women as the protectors of brown bodies at risk. Our girls will defend the human rights of their girls against the depredations of phallocentric fundamentalism. And of course, this kind of pseudo-feminist discourse pervaded Western news media before and throughout the Afghanistan war. A WikiLeaks document from March 2010, for example, shows that the CIA itself advocated using testimonials by Afghan women in order to boost flagging public support for the NATO presence. Some scholars point out, however, that this progressive messaging amounted to little more than window dressing. Carol Stabile and Deepa Kumar, for example, in a 2005 article, argue that the liberation of women was neither the aim of the war nor its result, commenting that the rhetoric of women's liberation was a cynical ploy, to use their phrase, and even, quote, a lie as monumental as the claims about WMD in Iraq. Similarly, Our Girl's emphasis on women's rights might be seen as what Zilla Eisenstein has called a sexual decoy, a progressive sounding pretext for military imperialism, a 21st century white woman's burden. Okay, second theme or aspect, patriotism and paranoia. Like contemporary British television documentaries about army life, and there's a lot of them, BBC Three's Girls on the Front Line, 2010, Channel 4's British Army Girls, 2016. Our Girl presents the military as a home from home for its young soldiers through various expressions of banal nationalism. The soldiers exchange friendly banter based on British regional stereotypes and proudly sing the national anthem together. Molly Dawes even fantasises that in the event of her death, she will have her name read out by the Prime Minister. Whatever turns you on, I suppose. Yet some characters do not belong to this patriotic community. In the first series, one of these outcasts is Molly Dawes' own father, Dave, a sexist slob whose main goal is securing long-term incapacity benefit. And in one of the drama's most reactionary character portraits, Dave Dawes spends his days dressed in a sleeveless wife beater, smoking, drinking, and stealing from his family. In short, he represents that long-standing figure of British tabloid outrage, the benefits scrounger. At the end of the pilot episode, parallel editing sharply differentiates father and daughter. Dawes proudly passes out as a soldier and goes to Afghanistan, while her do-nothing dad rots on the sofa watching television news reports about Al-Qaeda and playing violent video games. In Afghan 2, the British encounter many locals too lazy or corrupt to protect British lives. In season 3, for example, the British soldier's long-standing friend in the Afghan National Army, Captain Azizi, ultimately betrays the trust of the British, leading them into an ambush. Azizi is just one of many shadowy Muslim figures in Our Girl. Drawing on object relations theory, Hugh Ortega-Breton argues that TV dramas about the war on terror typically adopt a paranoid style, characterized by a splitting into good and evil characters. This melodramatic device, which offers audiences a feeling of moral certainty in anxious times, is common in post-9/11 screen fiction. And in Our Girl, it manifests as paranoia about the threat of the Muslim other. Molly Dawes casually expresses Orientalist attitudes throughout the series 1 pilot. And she says to her friend as they wander through the streets of East London, "There's always more of them on a Friday." And elsewhere joking that she is the last white woman on Catherine Road, long street in the East End of London. In fact, the atmosphere of Our Girl is suffused with what Juan Cole calls Islam anxiety. The troubling presence of Muslims in British society is foregrounded early in the pilot episode, which opens with a slow horizontal panning shot from Dawes' bedroom window across the rooftops of East London, accompanied by the Muslim call to prayer. Muslims here are audiovisually defamiliarized as strange attractors and uncanny presences. In episode 1.3, Dawes, on home leave from Afghanistan, travels through East London in a taxi. And she's going towards her house. A panning shot shows her view of the local streets, taking in burqa-clad Asian women, a halal butcher shop, and an Afghan restaurant. Lacking any dialogue and scored to a soundtrack whose rhythms and tonal intervals connote Arabic music, the sequence is laden with signs of Islamicness. This semiotic excess gives way to bathos at the end of the taxi ride, when Dawes notices that her local pub has closed down. In Lacanian terms, they have stolen our enjoyment. The white working class culture of London's East End is dying, while the Muslim community thrives. This same paranoid structure of feeling intensifies through the first 2 series. In the first episode of series 1, when Dawes is again on leave in East London, an encounter with a harmless Middle Eastern market vendor jolts her into a flashback to an earlier gunpoint ordeal at the hands of the Taliban. It's a moment of radical dépaysement as the familiar streets of Stratford are suddenly filled with the frightening sights and sounds of Helmand. Similarly, in series 2, Georgie Lane, on leave in the UK after a kidnapping ordeal, experiences terrifying hallucinations of the white al-Shabaab terrorist Abu Jasser and an impending sense of disaster. "We're so vulnerable," she says on a date with her boyfriend Jamie. As Lane loses her grip on reality, she dreams that Abu has entered her bedroom, and she later misidentifies a young man in a shopping mall as Abu. Dawes and Lane's hallucinations underline the figmental nature of the terrorist threat and of the war on terror itself, which has been described by Borghini et al. 2016 as a phantasmatic war fought according to the strategy of an invisible enemy. Abu himself is rendered in the paranoid style as an enigmatic bogeyman. He is often seen from behind, hooded or in shadow, recalling depictions of Muslim terrorists in other British war on terror dramas such as Spooks. Manifesting variously as terrorists, uncanny others, and spectral presences, Muslims in Argyll pose a ubiquitous threat to social and psychological order. Okay, third theme, recuperating critique. Argyll's depiction of the coalition occupation in Afghanistan is highly sanitized. Of course, this is true of most depictions of the British presence in Afghanistan, from BBC Three comedy drama Bluestone 42, if you've seen that, to Paul Kattis's docudrama Kajaki. Indeed, like Western news reporting about Afghanistan, British screen portrayals of the war generally avoid the shock of the real. In Argyll, the only British death alluded to is Geraint, is that of Geraint, a Welsh soldier who we are told was red-misted, that's the phrase used in the drama, red-misted by sadistic Taliban gunmen. Geraint is a worthy victim who inspires pity among the British soldiers, but the drama consistently represses any sympathy for Afghans killed by coalition forces. In the pilot episode, for example, Dawes meets Chris Ingrams, a cynical young Welshman who tells Dawes that the army exists to break down its recruits and turn them into killing machines. Dawes' Albanian boyfriend Artan, meanwhile, tells Dawes that the purpose of the British army is to kill Muslims. But both characters are quickly disgraced. Ingrams is shown to be an incompetent coward, and he's actually kicked out of the army. And Artan is exposed as a love rat. Another critical voice in series 1 is Shaza. Shaza is a neurotic and pretentious anti-war liberal. And she's always lecturing. She says, "I went on the march, not in my name," she earnestly tells Dawes. Befriending Dawes' mother with what later are suggested to be ulterior sexual motives, she is overcoded as a condescending middle-class interloper, slumming it among the humble folks of the East End. After learning that Shaza is a teacher who drives a camper van and whose real name is Felicity Barron, Dawes and her grandmother ridicule Shaza, even suggesting that she should be rolled into a carpet and lobbed off a bridge. Indeed, Shaza's unorthodox sexual and class identities mark her as an inauthentic misfit in the working class milieu. In the second series, a direct criticism of Western imperialism is put into the mouth of the drama's most rebarbative character, the Al-Shabaab terrorist Abu Jasser. Abu complains to an impressionable young Al-Shabaab recruit that they can kill thousands of our women and children without consequence. Barbaric as his own worldview is, his condemnation of Western violence is, of course, valid, but it's discredited in multiple ways. Georgie Lane twice describes Abu as evil, and it eventually emerges that Abu's descent into jihadism began when he was rejected by a Muslim girlfriend. A trivial rationalization. So these rationalizations serve to respectively abstract and banalize Abu's violent opinions, depriving them of any political force. Those who criticize the British military in Argyll then are disparaged as cowards, cheats, meddling middle-class homosexuals, or bitter losers. Okay, how am I doing for time?
Yeah, you've got a little
bit left. I won't take that much time, but I'll just I'll kind of conclude with a couple of contextualizing remarks. So feminist justifications for imperialism then are nothing new. In Britain, they trace back to the earliest days of the organised feminist movement in the 19th century. And British feminists of that time certainly participated in their culture's prevailing assumptions of national and racial superiority. But the context of feminist imperialism, if we can call it that, has evolved considerably since then, especially as more women have joined Western armed forces in recent decades. Just over 20 years ago, the feminist theorist Cynthia Enloe, who Vron mentioned this morning, warned that attempts to connect women's military service with discourses of human rights were increasingly serving to camouflage, she uses the word, militarism and imperialism. And in the 21st century, this trend has coincided with the revival of what Paul Gilroy calls civilizationalist common sense, following the attacks of 9/11, and the rise of what Kenichi Yamaguchi terms a new Orientalism that posits the incompatibility of Islam with democracy, human rights, and gender equality. Our Girl's depiction of British military operations reflects and reinforces all of these legitimizing discourses. And its representation of a soldiery committed to progressive values parallels the increasingly woke, in inverted commas, public image of repressive state apparatuses, eager to deflect attention from their violent operations with talk of racial equality and gender diversity. Okay, sorry that was such a sprint, but I just wanted to get through it fairly quickly so we can get to some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That's great. I'm going to...
So Milan's talk is entitled Mind Forged Manacles, or Militarism, Propaganda and Obedience. So if you're ready, Milan, I'll pass over to yourself.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Stephen. And I'm kind of picking up on themes that have already been raised. So this is a talk about war and militarism and propaganda, and Matt already started. Well, I'm sorry for missing this morning's sessions. I had got double booked, but Matt was talking there about the propaganda model. Gonna have a go at screen sharing. So I'm going to assume that this is working out okay. So the propaganda model of the mass media developed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. Noam Chomsky these days looks kind of more like this. That's where we're heading in this talk. There are 4 things that I want to assert or propose in this talk. War doesn't spring from our innate aggression as human beings. Militarism is more about obedience than about aggression. And if war is part of human nature, it's not because we're aggressive by nature, but because we're obedient by nature. And the final point is the most dangerous form of obedience today, I suggest, is intellectual subservience, especially unknowing conformity to official propaganda, what Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky called at one time brainwashing under freedom. So this is an image of an Israeli airstrike on Gaza a couple of months ago. Some people see images like this of conflict and they say, war is inevitable, it's just part of human nature. And there's nothing we can do about it. And for some people in that category, it makes sense, therefore, if war is so inevitable, that the only way to kind of stop it happening is to make it suicidal. And this is an image of a Trident missile being test fired in the Atlantic. As I'm sure everyone here knows, Britain's only nuclear weapon is the warhead carried on Trident missiles on Trident submarines. Talking about war, we have to distinguish between different kinds of violence against people. So let's distinguish between murder, feuding, and war. Murder is very straightforward. One person kills another person. There's some because there's some strong personal reason they have for doing that to this other person. Feuding is when this becomes a cycle of revenge killings between two families or family type groups. The most famous feud in literature is the Montagues and the Capulets. And in Romeo and Juliet, Tybalt kills Mercutio, who's not a Montague, but he's very closely associated with them. He's seen as a Montague, and for that, Romeo kills Tybalt, who's Juliet's cousin, a Capulet. And it's clear that there's about to be a runaway cycle of killings, of revenge for revenge, and that's why Romeo is banished from Verona to try to stop that from happening. So there's a very big difference between feuding and war. Feuding is personal. It's targeted at members of the family or people who are considered to be members of the family that you are in revenge. You're in a revenge cycle with. And war is impersonal and it's indiscriminate. There's not particular families in this street in Gaza who the pilot is targeting. If a Capulet walked down a street in Verona where Montagues lived, they wouldn't just be attacking anyone in that street. They'd be looking for members of that particular family or people who are closely associated with it. And feuding is between families or family type groups, with very close personal bonds like that, whereas war is between political communities. So the kinds of feelings that are going on in those two processes of feuding and war are very different. And when we look at violence against the person, we need to be clear about those distinctions. I learned about those distinctions from an anthropologist called Douglas Fry. This is the book that I read of his. More recently, he published this, he edited this collection, War, Peace and Human Nature. What Fry was particularly interested in was the sort of the prehistory of war and group violence. And there is an image in the popular consciousness of aggression being innate in human beings, stretching back into prehistory from our early modern human ancestors or further back to the Neanderthals and so on. It's very gendered, it's very much about the early human male and his brutality and aggression. And the idea is that there's a direct connection between that kind of violence and war today, that kind of internal aggression and war today. Is basically just to add technology. However, as I've just been saying, that murder and feuding, which we see a lot of evidence of feuding in earlier times, and Douglas Fry is particularly interested in studying today's hunter-gatherer societies. He's very interested in the relationship between the complexity of society and stratification of society and group violence and so on. But that's very different from war, what's going on in war. Now, it may be that many people feel that war is so natural because every day, most of us have feelings of anger, frustration, rage with other people. We have what feels like explosive rage and towards other people, which we contain. But because it's such a common experience that most of us have, I'm guessing that a lot of people just extrapolate from that, saying, well, if I feel like that all the time, then it's obvious that at some point war is going to happen. But war has got nothing to do with that kind of rage experience. Very familiar image of military training is square bashing, where you get military women or men drilling on a parade ground. They do not learn how to move in that kind of synchronized way through fury. That's not what's going on to achieve that kind of discipline. that kind of regularity and order and synchronization with their fellows. Army marches on its stomach. The meals here and in military messes all around the world, they're not cooked in a haze of fury, and the ingredients were not brought to the kitchen through supply lines, possibly intercontinental supply lines, the fuel and all the equipment and so on. That was not all done through murderous rage. That's not what was driving it. And there have been international supply lines for war for centuries. That, you know, war has involved logistical organizing, which is not driven by and governed by that rage that sometimes we feel, and which can lead to murder and to feuding. This is a component of a Tomahawk cruise missile in a Raytheon factory. Cruise missiles and drones and nuclear warheads are not designed or manufactured in a red mist of anger. That would be kind of a dangerous thing for those very delicate processes often. So what is going on in enabling war to happen is very far from that feeling of anger that lots of people experience a lot of the time. And wars are enabled fundamentally by finance. Taxes are not raised, budgets are not managed in a fury. That's not what is driving those processes, and that has been true for centuries, and well, in a very complex way, certainly since the invention of income tax in order to fund war. So there's a huge gap between, well, okay, here's a quote. It's a large step from what may be biologically innate leanings toward individual aggression. So large step from that to ritualized, socially sanctioned, institutionalized group warfare. That's a quote from two US anthropologists, Clifton Kroeber and Bernard Fontana. I learned about that in this brilliant book by Barbara Ehrenreich. And in Blood Rights, Barbara Ehrenreich quoted another anthropologist of war, Clark Macaulay, who said the hypothesis of a killer instinct is not so much wrong as irrelevant. So some of you may have been thinking when these pictures were flashing up earlier, but hang on a minute. We've all seen images of furious drill sergeants shouting at recruits. Well, it doesn't, isn't rage involved in a very important way in military training? Well, when you look at this image, the most important thing about this is not the anger of the drill sergeant, but it is the stillness, the silence, and the obedience of the recruits. The drill sergeant isn't just breaking down these recruits with his fury and humiliation and breaking them down and building them back up into different kind of people, and also training them how to cope with terrifying situations. What he's doing is he is training them to respond precisely, to say precisely the words they're instructed, to take precisely the actions that they're meant to take, or be rewarded with his furious tirades. So what's important here is not rage, because they're not meant to feel rage. What they're meant to feel is complete alignment with his will. And so this is actually, this just underlines that obedience and discipline are at the heart of what enables war, what the military is about, and in fact underlie all of the processes that we were just talking about. Now, this suggestion that militarism is centrally about obedience is something that I was hammered home to me in this brilliant book by Rudolf Rocker, Nationalism and Culture, which I think is a masterpiece work. Rocker very much rated the work of Honoré Daumier, who he said saw into the real nature of militarism. Daumier, this is a quote from Nationalism and Culture. Daumier knew too that militarism was not just the existence of standing armies. He had recognized clearly that here we have to deal with a special state of mind, which once it is artificially bred in him, transforms man into an unfeeling automaton that obeys every command blindly and takes no account of the consequences of his deed. This artificial crippling of the conscience and of individual reflection, which breaks down in man all moral control, all sense of personality, is the first presupposition of every militarism without distinction of flag or uniform. And Rocker added, militarism and a military establishment are not the same thing, although the existence of a standing army is to be regarded as the first prerequisite of militarism. Militarism is to be appraised first of all as a psychic condition. It is the renunciation of one's own thought and will. Militarism is the meanest and most degraded form of that slave spirit raised to the status of a national virtue, which despises all the rules of reason and is devoid of all human dignity. So today, I'm going to suggest that the most important and dangerous form of obedience that is going on is our unthinking, unaware subservience to official propaganda and the what Chomsky and Herman described as brainwashing under freedom. The propaganda model, to sum it up in very few words, is the proposition that the mass media, and in fact, cultural institutions generally, though the mass media is the easiest to study, serve power rather than truth. They serve powerful institutions while posing as the champions of truth. So there are a couple of features of the propaganda model which I'd like to just kind of glance at in this talk. One of the things that Chomsky wrote was that it's thought to be necessary to take over the entire spectrum of opinion, the entire spectrum of discussion, so that nothing can be thinkable apart from the party line. Not just that it be obeyed, but that you can't even think anything else. The state propaganda is not expressed, it's rather implicit, it's presupposed. So what Chomsky and Herman were pointing out was that in a totalitarian state like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, the state is concerned with what people do, with controlling people's behavior, whereas in a democratic state, those kinds of controls are not available. Since the state lacks the capacity to ensure obedience by force, thought can lead to action, and therefore the threat to order must be excised at the source. So you have to control what people think. So one phrase he's used has been, it's the spectrum of thinkable thought. And I've illustrated this spectrum with two pictures, one of a 200-foot high statue of Genghis Khan in Mongolia, representing authoritarianism and serving power, and at the other end, an image of anti-establishmentism. So in the liberal media self-image, there are those who are seen as super right-wing. I've chosen fairly or unfairly Melanie Phillips here as someone who's seen kind of at that far end. And then there are folks who are at the anti-establishment end. This is Simon Jenkins. He used to be editor of the Times, now writes for The Guardian. Melanie Phillips used to write for The Guardian, now she writes for the Times. Simon Jenkins is a right-wing figure, but he is one of the most independent voices in the mainstream media, I suggest. And I'm choosing him because he is one of the most anti-militarist voices in the mainstream media. So back in 2010, Simon Jenkins called for defense cuts of 100%. He wrote, "I say cut defense. I don't mean nibble at it or slice it. I mean cut it, all 45 billion pounds of it." So that, that's a very unusual position. Just a couple of months ago, Jenkins described the justifications for British military spending as nonsense. I want to come back to the nuclear issue. So in 2013, when the Lib Dems forced the coalition government to have a Trident alternatives review, that's the last time Britain's nuclear weapons were sort of discussed in a big way in the mainstream media. And on the 25th of September 2013, Simon Jenkins wrote in The Guardian that the government's commitment to retaining British nuclear weapons was irrational, mad, harebrained, hypocritical, absurd, and nonsense. All those adjectives in one article, in which he also said that the British nuclear force made no sense. He said that the British nuclear weapons bear no reference to any plausible threat to Britain that could possibly merit their use. They were, in his words, an irrelevance in the face of the enemies that Britain was likely to encounter. Enemies immune to nuclear weapons and heavy armor, enemies who hurl grenades and wield Kalashnikovs made in 1947. Now, so this is one of the most vitriolic attacks on British nuclear weapons that I've seen in the British mass media. But when you step back for a moment and look at what Jenkins is actually saying, what he's saying is that British nuclear weapons are irrelevant to the kinds of enemies that we're likely to face, and therefore they're irrational. So that's the extent of his critique. On that logic, if enemies appeared who could be countered by nuclear weapons, unlike insurgents in Iraq, then they would make sense. So Simon Jenkins's critique is a tactical criticism, not a criticism in principle of nuclear weapons as such from a legal point of view or a moral point of view. They are the wrong tool for achieving the foreign policy goals that Britain has set itself. He's not questioning the foreign policy goals that Britain has set itself. He's not questioning in this article how Britain is going out on military adventures across the world to achieve those foreign policy goals. What he's saying is that when we go and do that, nuclear weapons are not going to help us to defeat insurgents in the global south, and therefore we shouldn't be spending money on them. We should be spending money on things which are going to help us achieve our foreign policy goals. So what he's doing with his ferocious critique is he's actually reinforcing the idea that those foreign policy goals are acceptable and correct by his silence over them. He's reinforcing the idea that nuclear weapons are an acceptable way of exerting power in the world by making just a tactical critique rather than a critique in principle. So for that reason, because of the unspoken assumptions which underlie his vitriolic attacks, I think it's fair to say that Simon Jenkins is at the same position in the actual spectrum of service to power and anti-establishment feeling. So the reality of that spectrum is very different from the liberal self-image. Chomsky wrote that a useful rule of thumb is this: if you want to learn something about the propaganda system, have a close look at the critics and their tacit assumptions. These typically constitute the doctrines of the state religion. And so Simon Jenkins's attacks on British nuclear weapons are an example of what Chomsky calls feigned dissent. So tactical, based on mistakes that are being made, rather than on the enterprise in a fundamental way. So I'm going to carry on this nuclear theme. These are symbols for nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. I see what's coming up is that some of my slides are messing up. But in this, I think most people in the UK, and I would guess most people in this call, would be surprised to hear that British policy now and in the past has been that Britain reserves the right to use or threaten to use its nuclear weapons against enemies who don't have nuclear weapons, but who have biological or chemical weapons. I'm just going to say that again. I think people would be surprised to hear that British policy now and in the past has been, for some time, has been to be reserved the right to use or to threaten to use British nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states who have biological or chemical weapons. I think that's a kind of a newsworthy thing. Now, this next slide was meant to show the cover of the integrated review, but for some reason it's dropped out. So back in March, the government published this integrated review of defense and security policy. And in this report, it's actually stated what I just said. So you'll have to take that on trust for a moment. This is the Guardian's coverage of the integrated review on the day before it was published and the day that it was published. There are 6 stories, 2 of them published the day before because, like a lot of newspapers, they had a leaked copy, and then 4 on the day of. And if you read through them carefully, you'll find these 2 paragraphs. I've colored in the second lot of red letters. So I've colored in the words chemical or biological. So what these 2 paragraphs say is that there's been a change in policy, but existing policy was that Trident nuclear missiles could be fired at chemical or biological weapon states who are not nuclear powers. That is the logic of the grammar of the first sentence. And so that's quite a that's quite a newsworthy thing. When you look through the 6 stories, that fact about what's in the integrated review is in those 2 paragraphs which are highlighted in pink. That fact of what's in the integrated review doesn't appear in any of the other stories. The news stories, the sort of analytical news stories, the parliamentary sketch, which is about Boris Johnson making his announcement about the integrated review, or in the Guardian's editorial. So this is an example, I would say, of what Chomsky and Herman don't have a phrase for it. I'm going to call it censorship without censorship, where a fact can appear in public, but not reach the public consciousness because of the way it's presented. So one of the issues is placement. So as I said, there are 3 stories. There's a front page story, which is the cap on Trident warheads. And then there was an inside story that same day, that on the 16th, talking about several issues in the integrated review, but not mentioning this chemical or biological weapons side of it. And then the 3rd story does mention it. This page 2 story on the 17th. And so in terms of placement, the way that this information is placed is already signaling to us it's not very important. And in fact, when you just look at those sentences, just from how they're structured and the way that the chemical or biological bit is shoved right to the end of these long sentences, that's also signaling this isn't a very important topic. You don't need to bother that much about it. So one issue is placement. Another issue is what Chomsky and Herman call tone or kind of temperature. In the classic example of this, which they presented, they compared the New York Times's reporting of one Polish priest, the killing of one Polish priest during the Cold War, and the deaths of 100 Latin American religious figures in a similar sort of time frame. And what they found out was that not only was there quantitatively more column inches and more stories about that one Polish priest than the 100 religious martyrs in Latin America. That the quality or nature of that coverage was very different. Where for the Polish priest, it was there was a lot of emotion, there was a lot of reporting of people affected and so on. Whereas with the 100 religious martyrs in Latin America, it was very cold, factual, and clipped. And that's what we see also in this, the way that the chemical or biological weapon states being targeted is written about in that Guardian story. A third element is frequency of repetition. We've already seen this newsworthy fact, interesting, provocative fact is mentioned once in these 6 stories about the integrated review, and there's a lot of coverage about the integrated review. It's only mentioned once. And Chomsky and Herman say, furthermore, that the framework of discussion within which facts are presented also has a big effect on their impact, on how they come through to the public consciousness. And the framework of discussion of the integrated review is very much, again, taking for granted British state foreign policy goals, the legitimacy of the ways that the British state has been pursuing those goals, the legitimacy and legality and so on of British nuclear weapons. There's a huge amount of support given by silence in the framing of how these facts are delivered. And the basic message is, you don't need to bother about this. This is not an important fact, and you can forget about it. But if you do remember it, it's not that important. Okay, here's another image that has dropped out. I have a feeling the rest of my presentation has dropped out. Okay. What Chomsky and Herman say is that the enormous amount of material that is produced in the media and books makes it possible for a really assiduous and committed researcher to gain a fair representation. I think probably I should just drop out of this presentation because I think it's pretty much failed. Okay, so what Chomsky and Herman say is the enormous amount of material that is produced in the media and books makes it possible for a really assiduous and committed researcher to gain a fair picture of the world by cutting through the mass of misrepresentation and fraud to the nuggets hidden within. That the media provides some information about an issue proves absolutely nothing about the adequacy or accuracy of media coverage. The media do in fact suppress a great deal of information, but even more important is the way they present a particular fact, its placement, tone, and frequency of repetition, and the framework of analysis in which it is placed. That a careful reader looking for a fact can sometimes find it with diligence and a skeptical eye, tells us nothing about whether that fact received the attention and context it deserved, whether it was intelligible to most readers, or whether it was effectively distorted or suppressed. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that Guardian was outstandingly bad in its treatment of this aspect of the integrated review. There was nothing in the Financial Times. There were a couple of minimal mentions in the Telegraph along the lines that we've just seen. Same thing that was in the Telegraph. In the Times, there was also minimal mentions. However, they did mention this aspect in the editorial, which was quite different. Nothing on the independent website, as far as I can tell. In fact, the best coverage, actually, I think, was in the Daily Mail of this particular aspect. What is the significance of all of this? Well, if the media do not report objectionable facts, then the public will not object. The public will not restrain state policy. And that's why what happens in the media is so important, and why what Chomsky and Herman call the culture of terrorism that is built up by the media and other institutions has so much effect in the wider world in terms of state policy and the corporations and so on who can be affected by state policy. So to sum up again, war doesn't proceed from any innate aggressive tendencies that we may or may not have. war comes out of our capacity for obedience, and militarism is essentially about obedience rather than aggression. And I'm going to suggest that the most dangerous form of obedience that we have in British society and Western societies right now, and the thing which is most supportive of military action and militarism in general, is the kind of state propaganda that we can't even see because it's invisible, because it has captured the entire spectrum of thinkable thought. So my apologies for the breakdown of the presentation, but anyway, that's my talk.
Thank you very much, Milan. That was excellent, actually. Doesn't matter about the slides at all at the end there. Yes, fantastic talk. It was really clear, very thought-provoking. I know there's some people here that will have an interest in, some do have a direct interest in Herman and Chomsky, but there are many, many other things in that talk that people might want to pull out and discuss. So we've got about, we've got up to half an hour reserved for questions and comments. So please don't hold back. You can either put a question into the chat or you can raise your hand, as I see Louis has just done. So yeah, over to you, Louis, for the first question.
Yeah, that was really fantastic. Really interesting points. And I think actually really important points about how we maybe see conflict in relation to, you know, well, big conflict, which is war, and in relation to kind of human conflict, which is obviously smaller. I think that those are excellent points. Well, I suppose two small ones. This idea of that, you know, talking about Daumier as well, and I think Daumier also explored in his artwork this idea of self-hate, particularly self-hate of sort of the working classes and so forth. And I wonder how self-hate actually has been turned into and motivated for, you know, hate against others and so forth. And I think there's something about that, I think also particularly in kind of American military kind of cultures and so forth. But the other one that I was thinking, which is just a thought, which is the guy that you mentioned who was talking about kind of defunding the military budget. You know, in some ways I kind of wonder what difference it would make, because then presumably the UK would become a kind of protectorate of American foreign policy, which actually it is already. Kind of so yeah. So it's so I wonder if that would actually make any negligible difference if you just completely gutted the funding of it, although that money clearly would be better spent somewhere else, but like education perhaps. But yeah, fantastic talk. Just thought I'd chuck those out there.
I don't know if you want to come back to that, to any of those points, Milan, or we can take another question. If
I would like to comment, but maybe take a few if there are more folk, and then take a bunch.
Any